Paradox of voting. Paradox. Imagine you're deciding whether to vote in an upcoming election. You care deeply about the outcome, but when you calculate the chances of your individual vote making a difference, the odds seem infinitesimally small. After all, even in highly contested elections, your single vote has a negligible impact on the overall result. Yet despite this, millions of people continue to vote. Why do they do it? This is the essence of the paradox of voting. It poses a fundamental question about rationality and participation in democratic processes. If voting has such a small chance of influencing the outcome, why bother? According to classical economic and decision theory, rational choice theory suggests that voting is irrational, since the expected benefit of voting, your vote's impact, is so small, and yet people vote in large numbers, defying this logic. The paradox highlights the conflict between individual self-interest and collective action, and challenges us to think about the deeper reasons for political participation. Let's explore the paradox of voting and understand why individuals might choose to participate in elections even when it seems logically irrational. The paradox of voting was first formally articulated by Anthony Downs, a political economist, in his book An Economic Theory of Democracy, 1957. Downs applied the principles of rational choice theory to voting behaviour, analysing the costs and benefits of voting from an individual's perspective. According to rational choice theory, individuals act in ways that maximise their own utility, meaning that they will only take action if the benefit outweighs the cost. In the context of voting, Downs observed that the cost of voting, in terms of time, effort and resources, often exceeds the expected benefit, the impact of one vote on the election outcome, especially in large-scale elections, where the probability of any single vote deciding the outcome is extremely low. Therefore, rational choice theory predicts that individuals should not vote at all because the expected utility of voting is almost zero. However, despite this logical conclusion, voting is a universal practice in democratic societies. The paradox of voting arose from this discrepancy. Why do people vote if it's not rational from an individual standpoint? Over the years, scholars have proposed various theories to explain this behaviour, including social norms, civic duty, and psychological benefits that may make voting feel valuable beyond its actual political impact. The paradox has been central to the study of political behaviour, voter turnout, and collective action in political science and economics, sparking debates about the true motivations behind voting and democratic engagement. The paradox of voting presents an interesting and counterintuitive problem that challenges the rational framework often used in economic theory. It asks why people vote when the rational choice theory predicts that their individual vote will have no discernible impact on the election's outcome. Despite this, voter turnout remains high in many democracies, leading to the paradox, why vote if it doesn't matter? Let's break down the paradox, its implications, and explore the potential explanations for why people continue to vote despite its apparent irrationality. 1. The setup of the paradox of voting. The paradox of voting can be summarized in the following simple terms. Voter participation in an election requires effort, time, and resources. The individual costs of voting can be significant, whether it's time spent in line, transportation costs, or the effort needed to make an informed choice. The expected benefit of voting, on the other hand, is extremely small. In any large election, such as a presidential election or general election, the probability that your vote will change the outcome is almost zero. This is because the number of voters is so large that the chance of one person's vote affecting the result is infinitesimally small. Rational choice theory predicts that if an individual is acting purely out of self-interest and seeks to maximize their utility, they should not vote. Given that the expected benefit of voting is nearly zero, the costs of voting outweigh the benefits, so voting would be considered irrational from an individual standpoint. Yet, in practice, we observe that millions of people vote in democratic elections every year, making the paradox all the more striking. People act against their own rational self-interest by casting votes that are unlikely to change the outcome. 2. Rational choice theory and the paradox. Rational choice theory suggests that individuals make decisions by comparing the costs and benefits of their actions. The theory asserts that people will only take an action if the expected benefit exceeds the cost. Applying this to voting, The costs of voting include time spent registering, traveling to the polling station, and the mental effort involved in making an informed decision. In larger elections, these costs can add up, especially if the election is far from the individual's home or if the person is uncertain about how to vote. The benefit of voting is the impact that your vote will have on the outcome of the election. The expected benefit of voting is the likelihood that your single vote will swing the election result. In large elections, where millions of voters participate, the chances of any one vote affecting the outcome are extremely small. Rational choice theory therefore suggests that it is irrational to vote, since the costs of voting outweigh the expected benefits. This presents the core paradox. Why do people vote then? If voting is so clearly irrational in a cost-benefit sense, what drives people to participate in elections? 3. The influence of social and psychological factors. While rational choice theory focuses on self-interest and expected utility, real-world voting behavior is influenced by a number of social and psychological factors that go beyond strict rationality. These factors help to explain why people vote, even when the economic payoff is minimal. A. Civic duty. One of the most powerful explanations for the paradox is the concept of civic duty. Many people feel a moral obligation to vote, driven by a sense of social responsibility or a belief in the importance of participating in the democratic process. This feeling of duty can often override the rational calculation of cost versus benefit. For instance, research has shown that people who identify strongly with their community or country are more likely to vote, even if their vote is unlikely to have a significant impact on the election. In this sense, voting becomes a civic norm, where the act of voting itself is valued, not just the outcome of the election. B. Social norms and peer pressure. Social norms play a significant role in voting behavior. In many communities, voting is socially expected. People vote because others expect them to. Peer pressure and family traditions can encourage individuals to vote, even when they know their vote may not make a difference. These social incentives can often outweigh rational choice considerations. For example, some people might vote simply because they've always been taught that voting is important, and they don't want to let down their friends or family by not participating. This sense of social obligation can lead people to vote even if they believe the impact of their vote will be negligible. Psychological satisfaction. There is also a psychological benefit to voting. Many people feel a sense of satisfaction or empowerment from participating in the election process, even if their vote doesn't change the outcome. Voting can give people a sense of agency, allowing them to feel like they are contributing to the greater good, or that their voice is being heard. This feeling of personal fulfillment can be a strong motivator, particularly when individuals perceive the election as important. D. Altruism and collective action. In addition to civic duty and social norms, the altruistic motive can also play a role in voting behavior. Some individuals vote because they believe that their participation contributes to the welfare of society as a whole. Even if they are aware that their vote may not affect the outcome of the election, they may feel that voting is important for strengthening democracy and ensuring that future generations have a functioning system of government. 4. Game theory and the paradox of voting. In game theory, the paradox of voting is often framed as a collective action problem. The decision to vote is a strategic interaction between individuals, where everyone's participation leads to a collective benefit. The paradox lies in the fact that, while individual participation seems irrational, the collective outcome of widespread voting has enormous value for the functioning of the democratic system. A. The free rider problem. One of the key game theory concepts related to the paradox of voting is the free rider problem. In a free rider scenario, individuals may refrain from voting because they believe that others will vote on their behalf and their own vote won't make a difference. If enough people think this way, voter turnout decreases and the system suffers. The no-show paradox, where people fail to show up because they believe others will fill the void, is a form of free riding. B. The importance of voting coalitions can help resolve the paradox. By forming groups of voters who share common interests, the impact of each individual vote increases. This way, people feel that their vote matters more, leading to higher turnout. However, this is still difficult to achieve in large elections, where individual contributions are perceived to have minimal impact. 5. Broader implications of the paradox of voting. The paradox of voting extends beyond individual voting behavior to the broader questions of democratic participation and political legitimacy. A. Voter turnout and political representation. Low voter turnout can undermine the legitimacy of an election and the representation of the electoral system. In democracies, it is important to maximize participation so that the government is seen as legitimately elected by a broad cross-section of the population. The paradox challenges efforts to increase voter engagement, especially when people's rational self-interest suggests they should not vote. B. Reforming voting systems. The paradox also has implications for voting system reform. For example, the introduction of ranked choice voting or proportional representation may alter the incentives for voters and encourage higher turnout by making every vote matter more in the electoral process. This could shift the focus from individual self-interest to group action and collective benefit, resolving some of the issues raised by the paradox of voting. Parondo's paradox. Imagine you are playing a game of chance, where the rules seem to guarantee that you will lose. But what if I told you that by combining two losing strategies, you could actually win? This is the essence of Parondo's paradox, a counterintuitive concept from the world of probability theory and game theory. Named after Spanish physicist Juan Parondo, this paradox suggests that two independent losing strategies, when combined in a certain way, can produce a winning outcome. At first glance, this seems illogical. How could combining two bad strategies result in something good? The paradox sheds light on the surprising nature of randomness and strategy. In the world of games, business, or even decision-making, sometimes what seems like a losing path can unexpectedly lead to success when approached with the right combination. Let's explore Parondo's paradox and uncover how it demonstrates the hidden power of combining seemingly bad strategies to achieve an overall positive outcome. Parondo's paradox was introduced by Spanish physicist Juan Parondo in 1996 as a result of his work in probability theory and stochastic processes. Parondo discovered the paradox while examining games of chance that seemed to lead to a loss, but when combined in a certain sequence, the two losing strategies unexpectedly became a winning strategy. The paradox was initially discovered while exploring the asymmetric random walk, a process where a player's movement in a game is determined by random decisions, but the probabilities are weighted in such a way that the player is expected to lose over time. Parondo found that by alternating between two bad strategies, the result could actually be a positive outcome. This was surprising because in conventional game theory, two losing strategies would be expected to compound each other's negative effects, resulting in further losses. Parondo's paradox sparked interest in the field of game theory, especially as it relates to non-intuitive results in probabilistic systems. The paradox has been applied not only to gambling and games of chance, but also to economics, business strategies, and even biology, where random events can sometimes combine to produce successful outcomes in seemingly unpredictable systems. The paradox serves as a reminder that randomness and strategy don't always operate in linear ways, and that systems often display emergent properties that defy straightforward expectations. Parondo's paradox challenges our traditional understanding of strategy and probability by illustrating how combining two seemingly losing strategies can result in a winning outcome. At first glance, it may appear illogical, but the paradox has far-reaching implications for understanding how randomness, strategy, and probabilistic systems interact. Let's break down the paradox and explore its deeper implications for game theory, business, and decision-making. 1. The setup of Parondo's paradox. Parondo's paradox is often presented in the context of a simple game of chance or a random process, where a player has to make decisions based on probabilistic rules. The key elements of the paradox are Strategy A, a losing strategy that, when played alone, will result in an expected loss over time. Strategy B, another losing strategy that also results in an expected loss when played independently. In Parondo's original formulation, both Strategy A and Strategy B would seem to lead to a loss. The expected probability of winning is negative in both cases, meaning that if the player chooses only one of these strategies, they will lose money in the long run. However, the twist comes when the player alternates between the two strategies in a specific sequence. By combining the two losing strategies in a strategic way, the overall outcome of the game can shift from losing to winning. A. The role of randomness and probability at the core of Parondo's paradox is the interaction between randomness and strategy. In both individual strategies, the randomness involved in the game leads to a negative outcome. However, The act of combining the strategies in a specific sequence introduces a non-linear effect that leads to a positive outcome. In simple terms, randomness and probability are not always additive. Sometimes, combining random processes can result in an emergent behavior that defies expectation. Parondo's paradox is a striking example of how seemingly unconnected random events, when structured in a certain way, can produce a positive result. 2. The mathematical explanation of Parondo's paradox. The mathematical framework behind Parondo's paradox involves stochastic processes and random walks. A random walk is a process in which a player's movement is determined by random events, and the player's progress or loss depends on the outcomes of those events. A. Strategy A, the losing walk. Let's define strategy A as a random walk in which the player has a higher probability of losing than winning. For example, let's say that in each step the player has a 60% chance of losing and a 40% chance of winning. Over time, this strategy would lead to an overall loss. B. Strategy B. Another losing walk strategy, B, can be defined similarly, but with different probabilities. In this case, let's assume that the player has a 55% chance of losing and a 45% chance of winning. This strategy also results in an expected loss, but it's slightly less damaging than strategy A in terms of probability. C. Combining the strategies now, let's introduce the combination of strategy A and strategy B. By alternating between these two strategies in a specific sequence, the player can alter the overall expected probability of winning. The key is that strategy A and strategy B are not simply combined together, but rather alternated or played according to a rule that creates a non-linear effect. In some cases, the alternating sequence between the two losing strategies actually increases the probability of winning. This happens because the random fluctuations introduced by switching between strategies create emergent behavior that makes it possible to gain in the long run. For example, if a player alternates between a strategy with a higher probability of losing and one with a slightly smaller chance of losing, they might end up in a state where the average outcome of the entire game is positive, even though each individual strategy on its own is a losing proposition. 3. Intuition behind the paradox's paradox. It's helpful to consider how randomness and probability work in everyday life. In many systems, seemingly small or insignificant fluctuations can lead to unexpected large outcomes. The paradox shows how non-linear interactions between different strategies can create emergent behaviors that are not simply the sum of their parts. A. The power of alternating in Parondo's paradox. The key element is the act of alternating strategies. While strategy A is a losing strategy and strategy B is also a losing strategy, when the player switches between the two, the sequence creates a new probabilistic structure. This structure might enable the player to take advantage of the random fluctuations in ways that are not possible when each strategy is used independently. B. Randomness as a hidden asset. The paradox also demonstrates that randomness is not inherently a disadvantage. In fact, when used strategically, randomness can be harnessed to create positive outcomes. By using randomness in alternating strategies, the player effectively transforms what was once a losing game into a winning game. This teaches us that sometimes randomness, when approached with the right strategy, can work in our favor. 4. Applications of Parondo's paradox. While Parondo's paradox was initially framed in the context of a game of chance, the underlying principles have applications in various fields including A. Economics and finance. In economics, the paradox can be applied to situations where individuals or companies combine seemingly bad financial strategies to generate positive outcomes. For example, companies might diversify their risk by investing in both risky and safe assets, and through the strategic combination of these investments, they could achieve a higher overall return than if they relied on just one investment strategy. B. Business strategy. In business, Parondo's paradox can be used to explain how organizations can combine risky ventures with conservative approaches to maximize the potential for growth while mitigating losses. For example, a company might simultaneously invest in experimental products, which may have a low probability of success, and well-established products, which have a steady but lower return. And by alternating between the two, they can achieve a favorable overall outcome. Biology and evolution. Parondo's paradox has even been applied to biological processes and evolutionary strategies. In evolutionary biology, it has been suggested that combining seemingly disadvantageous traits in a population could lead to better adaptation over time. For instance, a combination of low-risk and high-risk genetic traits might enable organisms to survive and thrive in fluctuating environments, despite each individual strategy being less effective on its own. 5. Implications for decision theory and rationality. The Bootstrap Paradox has significant implications for decision theory and how we think about rationality and strategy. The paradox challenges the traditional view that rational decision-making always involves choosing the best option based on available information. Instead, it shows that non-linear strategies, such as combining seemingly bad strategies, can produce better results than expected. A. Non-linearity and emergent behavior. The paradox forces us. Preparedness paradox. Imagine you spend weeks, months, or even years preparing for a potential disaster. You gather supplies, create emergency plans, and train for the worst-case scenario. Then, the moment arrives, and the disaster never happens. In fact, it never even comes close to happening. This is the preparedness paradox, where the very act of preparation for an event can reduce its likelihood or impact, but at the same time it creates a new set of risks and misperceptions that can lead to overreaction. The paradox lies in the fact that the more prepared we are for a disaster or crisis, the more unlikely it is to occur. But our actions often lead us to overestimate the risk and act irrationally when we perceive a threat. Let's explore how the preparedness paradox plays out in various contexts, from personal safety and public health to global security, and how our response to potential disasters can often lead to unexpected consequences. The preparedness paradox is a concept found at the intersection of risk management, psychology, and decision theory. It describes the seemingly counterintuitive situation in which extensive preparation for a disaster or crisis reduces the likelihood of that event occurring, but simultaneously triggers overreaction or false confidence. The paradox has its roots in the idea that anticipating and mitigating risks can sometimes lead to unintended consequences. The paradox is often discussed in the context of public health, disaster preparedness, and military strategy. In these fields, preparedness is seen as crucial for reducing the impact of catastrophic events. However, extensive preparation, whether through the creation of emergency plans, building safety systems, or investing in defense mechanisms, can sometimes create a false sense of security or encourage overreaction. This can lead to excessive resource allocation or the perception that a threat is more imminent than it actually is, leading to irrational decisions. In the context of disaster preparedness and emergency management, the paradox is particularly relevant. As societies invest in preparing for rare events like pandemics, natural disasters, or terrorist attacks, they often find that the effort required to prevent these risks can exacerbate the very problem they are trying to address by distorting perceptions of actual danger. This paradox challenges our understanding of rationality and risk assessment when it comes to preparing for extreme but unlikely events. The preparedness paradox is a powerful reminder that while preparation for potential disasters is crucial, the way we approach risk management can sometimes backfire. By over-preparing or focusing too much on improbable events, we can create new forms of risk and uncertainty. Let's break down the paradox and its implications for decision-making, risk assessment, and human behavior. The preparedness paradox arises when the actions taken to prepare for a crisis reduce the likelihood of that crisis occurring, but also alter the risk environment in ways that lead to overreaction or irrational decisions. It's a situation where high preparedness for a disaster or crisis often results in lower probabilities of that event happening or becoming catastrophic. However, the actions taken in preparation, whether physical, emotional, or policy-based, can distort perceptions of risk, leading people to either overestimate the likelihood of the disaster or take unnecessary or excessive precautions. At its core, the paradox involves the tension between preventative action and the misunderstanding of risk. When we prepare for something, we tend to increase our awareness of the threat and focus on the worst-case scenario. This, in turn, can cause us to become overly concerned about an event that is becoming less and less likely due to our own preparedness. One of the central elements of the preparedness paradox is the discrepancy between actual risk and perceived risk. While preparation typically reduces the probability and severity of a potential event, such as a disaster or health crisis, it can simultaneously lead to an overestimation of the likelihood of the event. For instance, preparing for a natural disaster, like a hurricane or earthquake, often leads people to become more aware of the risk and more attuned to signs that a disaster may be imminent. But as people prepare more extensively, they might perceive the risk to be higher than it actually is, leading them to take irrational actions, such as hoarding supplies or evacuating unnecessarily. Preparedness can also lead to false confidence. As people prepare for an event, they may believe they have eliminated all risk or made themselves invulnerable to the consequences of the disaster. This can create a sense of overconfidence that may make them more reckless in their actions. For example, emergency preparedness drills or the stockpiling of resources might make people feel secure, but this sense of security might lead them to underestimate the potential consequences of a crisis, which in turn results in poor decision-making during an actual event. The preparedness paradox is not just a theoretical concept, it plays out in real-world situations across a variety of fields. Here are a few examples where preparedness leads to unintended consequences. One of the most striking examples of the preparedness paradox is in the context of public health and pandemic preparedness. Governments and health organizations spend substantial resources preparing for potential outbreaks of diseases such as the flu, Zika virus, or COVID-19. In preparing for these crises, they create plans, emergency stockpiles, and public health campaigns. While this preparation can certainly reduce the impact of an outbreak, it can also lead to overreaction. For instance, in response to a pandemic, the intensity of preparedness efforts can inflame public fear about the likelihood and scale of the crisis. This can lead to panic buying, overuse of resources, and social disruption. In the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, global stockpiling and emergency health measures led to widespread overreaction in some areas, even though the full-scale impact of the disease was not immediately as severe as anticipated. People's preparedness for a global health disaster led them to perceive the risk as more immediate and widespread than it actually was. In the wake of high-profile terrorist attacks, such as 9/11, many governments implemented extensive security measures to prevent future attacks. These measures included airport security screenings, surveillance programs, and counter-terrorism strategies. While these efforts reduced the likelihood of successful attacks, they also created a false sense of security in some cases, as well as unnecessary panic. Moreover, the overreaction to potential threats, such as increased security and invasive screening, could create a feedback loop, where citizens become more fearful and perceive higher risks even though the probability of an actual event may be low. As a result, the economic and social costs of heightened security may outweigh the benefits of the prepared measures, leading to inefficiencies and unintended consequences. Another example is the preparation for natural disasters like hurricanes, earthquakes, or wildfires. Communities that have experienced such events often engage in extensive disaster preparedness activities, such as building fortified shelters, creating evacuation plans, and stockpiling resources. These efforts reduce the physical damage when a disaster strikes, but they can also lead to misperceptions about the likelihood and severity of the threat. For example, in areas with regular hurricane drills and evacuation plans, people may become overly cautious and evacuate too early or too often. They might also overstock supplies, leading to wasteful resource allocation. False confidence in the ability to mitigate risk may make people less prepared to handle the real consequences when a disaster does occur, because they may underestimate the long-term effects of their actions. In addition to rational decision-making, the preparedness paradox is influenced by psychological and social factors. Understanding these factors is crucial for addressing the paradox in practical situations. The paradox highlights how human psychology shapes our perception of risk. Over-preparing for a disaster or crisis often leads to heightened anxiety and fear. People tend to overestimate the likelihood of rare events, especially when they have been primed by media, warnings, or personal experience. This phenomenon is known as the availability heuristic, where people judge the likelihood of an event based on how easily they can recall similar instances. Social dynamics also play a role in the paradox. In situations where preparedness is collective, such as community-based disaster management programs or military defense systems, individual overreaction can occur when individuals or groups believe that their actions are necessary for the greater good. However, if everyone adopts this mindset, it can lead to collective inefficiencies and unnecessary actions that waste resources or create social unrest. The paradox also reveals the importance of trust in cooperative systems. Over-preparing for a disaster can lead to a lack of trust in the system, with individuals feeling that their personal actions are needed to mitigate risk. In contrast, when trust in community or government efforts is high, people are more likely to participate in collective preparedness without resorting to extreme measures. While the preparedness paradox is a challenging issue, it can be addressed through rational risk assessment and proportional response. Here are some ways to navigate the paradox effectively. One way to resolve the paradox is through education and public awareness campaigns that focus on realistic risk assessment. By educating people about the actual probabilities of disasters and the appropriate levels of preparedness, we can reduce the emotional response to crises and focus on proportional, effective actions. Rather than preparing for every possible scenario with an all-encompassing approach, adaptive strategies that focus on flexibility and evolution in response to changing risks can help. This includes scenario-based planning that accounts for probabilistic outcomes and focuses on responding effectively when actual events occur, rather than overreacting in anticipation. Fostering collaboration among government, communities, and individuals can lead to more efficient and coordinated risk management efforts. Collaborative risk management helps avoid redundant preparations and ensures that resources are used in the most effective manner without causing panic or unnecessary action. Prevention paradox. Imagine you're living in a community where a health initiative is put in place to reduce the risk of a widespread disease, such as a vaccination campaign or a public health awareness program. The goal is clear: to reduce the number of people who get sick or affected by the disease. Yet, when you look at the results, something strange happens. The disease prevalence in the community goes down, but the individual benefit of the intervention seems minimal, and many people don't feel a direct impact on their own health. This is the essence of the prevention paradox, a situation where preventive measures that reduce overall risk are perceived as less beneficial to individuals than they actually are, leading to underutilization or misunderstanding of the benefits. The paradox shows how public health measures, which benefit society as a whole, may not always seem compelling or necessary to individuals, even when they contribute to overall well-being. Let's explore the prevention paradox and uncover why individual actions that seem less impactful can still play a key role in risk reduction and public health. The prevention paradox was first discussed in the context of public health by British epidemiologist Geoffrey Rose in his 1985 work, Sick Individuals and Sick Populations. Rose's insight was that preventive measures, such as vaccination programs, lifestyle changes, or public health campaigns, often seem ineffective or underwhelming when considered from the perspective of individuals, even though they can have tremendous effects on the population as a whole. For example, a vaccination program aimed at preventing a widespread disease like the flu may dramatically reduce the incidence of illness in a community, but for any single individual, the probability of contracting the disease might still be low, even without the vaccine. Therefore, individuals may perceive the vaccine as unnecessary for their own health, even though it contributes to herd immunity and reduces overall community risk. The prevention paradox highlights the disconnect between individual benefits and population-level outcomes, revealing a fundamental challenge in public health communication and policy implementation. People often fail to appreciate the collective impact of preventive actions when they don't perceive an immediate personal benefit. This paradox underscores the need for incentives and awareness campaigns that help individuals recognize the value of preventive actions, even when their direct benefits may not be immediately apparent. The prevention paradox challenges the idea that preventive measures should always have immediate, visible benefits to be seen as valuable. It highlights the tension between individual behavior and population health. While preventive measures may seem underwhelming at the individual level, their effects on the overall community can be profound. Let's break down the paradox, its implications, and how it plays a significant role in public health, risk management, and social behavior. The prevention paradox occurs when individuals perceive preventive actions such as vaccination, screening, or lifestyle changes as ineffective or unnecessary because the probability of their personal risk is low. However, collectively, these measures can have a significant impact on population-level risk. In a situation where a preventive measure is introduced to reduce a public health risk, such as a vaccination program for hepatitis B, the overall benefit to the community may be substantial because it reduces the number of people who become infected. But for an individual who believes they are at low risk, the benefit of the intervention may seem insignificant. This discrepancy creates the paradox. While the population is better off, the individual's perceived benefit is minimal, leading to lower participation or engagement in the preventive behavior. In the case of preventive measures, the individual benefit is often diluted because the risk is spread across the population. For example, if a vaccination campaign reduces the likelihood of a disease outbreak by 70%, the individual likelihood of contracting the disease may be low to begin with, and even with the vaccine, it might seem like the disease is unlikely to affect them. However, on a population level, the reduction in overall risk is significant, and the collective benefit is greater than the sum of individual benefits. But because people are primarily concerned with their own immediate risk, they may underestimate the importance of participating in preventive actions. One classic example of the prevention paradox is the introduction of vaccination programs in countries where the disease being vaccinated against is already rare. For example, in countries with successful polio eradication programs, individuals may perceive the risk of polio as minimal because it is no longer a widespread issue. As a result, they may fail to get vaccinated, believing that they are not at risk and that vaccinating themselves is unnecessary. Yet, the impact of widespread vaccination is not seen in individual outcomes, but in herd immunity, the collective protection of the entire population. When enough people are vaccinated, it reduces the overall incidence of disease and protects vulnerable individuals who cannot be vaccinated for medical reasons. The paradox arises when individuals do not recognize that their participation in a preventive program is essential for the collective well-being. The prevention paradox highlights the disconnect between individual risk perception and population-level outcomes. This discrepancy often arises from cognitive biases and psychological factors that influence how people assess risk and benefit. Several key psychological factors contribute to this paradox. The availability heuristic is a psychological phenomenon where people tend to estimate the likelihood of an event based on how easily they can recall examples of that event. When the risk of a disease is low or the disease is rarely seen in a community, people are less likely to perceive it as a threat. This can lead to underestimation of the need for preventive measures, especially when individuals have not experienced the consequences of the disease firsthand. For example, if an individual has never known anyone with hepatitis A or influenza, they may perceive the risk of contracting the disease as extremely low. As a result, they may decide not to get vaccinated, even though the overall community benefit of vaccination is significant. Optimism bias is the tendency for people to believe that they are less likely to experience negative events compared to others. In the context of health, individuals often believe that they are immune to certain diseases or more likely to recover than others. This bias leads them to downplay the importance of preventive measures like vaccinations, thinking that they won't be personally affected by the disease. The prevention paradox plays out in such cases, as individuals may ignore the fact that preventive measures are less about individual outcomes and more about population health. Even if they personally feel safe, their decision not to participate reduces the effectiveness of the overall public health intervention. Hyperbolic discounting refers to the tendency to place more value on immediate rewards than on long-term benefits. People are often more motivated to act when they perceive immediate consequences, such as feeling sick, rather than when the benefits are distant or abstract, such as avoiding the risk of a disease years down the line. In the case of preventive health behaviors, the immediate payoff, such as feeling healthier or avoiding short-term inconvenience, is often lacking, and the long-term benefits of risk reduction are harder to perceive. This creates a disconnect between the individual's perception of immediate risk and the long-term benefits of prevention. The prevention paradox poses significant challenges for public health initiatives. If individuals do not understand the collective importance of preventive measures, it can undermine the effectiveness of programs designed to protect the entire population. Here are some ways to address the paradox. Educating the public about the long-term benefits of prevention and the importance of collective action is crucial in addressing the paradox. By emphasizing how individual actions contribute to the greater good, public health campaigns can encourage greater participation in preventive measures. For instance, campaigns that stress the importance of herd immunity and vaccination. Programs can help individuals understand how their actions impact the community at large, even if the individual benefit seems small. Governments and public health organizations can address the prevention paradox by making preventive measures more accessible and convenient. Policies that reduce barriers to preventive health, such as subsidizing vaccinations, offering free screenings, or creating health incentive programs, can encourage greater participation by minimizing the perceived costs of preventive actions. The way preventive actions are framed can significantly impact how people perceive their value. By reframing prevention as an investment in long-term health and community well-being rather than a temporary inconvenience, public health organizations can shift focus from the short-term discomfort to the long-term rewards. The prevention paradox highlights the limits of rational decision-making in the context of public health and collective action. While individuals may make decisions based on their personal perceptions of risk, effective prevention requires a shift in perspective, from individual benefit to societal benefit. The paradox is a clear example of the tragedy of the commons, where individual actions, or lack thereof, can undermine the collective good. If everyone makes the rational choice to avoid preventive measures because the personal benefits seem low, the entire community suffers from a higher risk of disease or catastrophe. The prevention paradox reminds us that cooperative efforts are necessary for long-term health, but they require a shift in mindset from individualism to collective responsibility. Prisoner's dilemma paradox. Imagine you and your partner are both arrested for a crime. The prosecutor offers each of you a deal. If you betray your partner and they stay silent, you walk free while they get a long sentence. If both of you betray each other, you both get moderate sentences. But if you both stay silent, you each get a short sentence. What do you do? Do you betray your partner for the chance of walking free? Or do you trust them and risk a long sentence? This is the prisoner's dilemma, one of the most famous paradoxes in game theory. On the surface, the best individual strategy seems to betray your partner. After all, you get the best personal outcome if you betray while they stay silent. But if both of you choose betrayal, you both end up worse off than if you had cooperated. The paradox lies in the tension between individual rationality and collective good. It shows how self-interest can lead to a suboptimal outcome for everyone involved. Let's dive into the prisoner's dilemma paradox, where cooperation and self-interest collide in a way that forces us to rethink our ideas of rationality and group dynamics. The prisoner's dilemma was first formulated by Albert Tucker in 1950. As part of a series of experiments in game theory, a field pioneered by mathematician John von Neumann and economist Oscar Morgenstern. The paradox was developed as a way to understand the dynamics of cooperation and competition in social interactions, particularly in situations where individuals face the choice of acting in their self-interest versus the greater good of the group. The classic setup involves two prisoners who are accused of a crime. The prosecutor offers them a deal where, if both stay silent, they each receive a short sentence. If both betray each other, they receive moderate sentences. If one betrays while the other stays silent, the betrayer goes free and the silent partner gets a long sentence. The paradox is that, from an individual perspective, betraying the partner seems to be the rational choice, because it offers the possibility of walking free. However, when both prisoners betray each other, they both end up worse off than if they had cooperated and remained silent. The prisoner's dilemma became a central model in game theory and economics, illustrating the conflict between individual rationality and collective benefit. It has applications in fields as diverse as economics, politics, evolutionary biology, and sociology, providing insight into how cooperation can arise or fail to arise in situations of interdependence. The prisoner's dilemma paradox highlights the tension between self-interest and collective well-being, showing how rational individual decisions can lead to suboptimal outcomes for all parties involved. It is a fundamental paradox that reveals the complexities of human behavior in situations involving trust, cooperation, and competition. Let's break down the paradox, its structure, and its broader implications for decision-making, game theory, and real-world applications. The prisoner's dilemma is a classic example of a non-zero-sum game, meaning that the total amount of benefits, or harm, can vary depending on the decisions made by the players. The game involves two players, in the classic scenario, two prisoners, each faced with the choice of cooperation or betrayal, also known as defection. The decision structure of the prisoner's dilemma is as follows. If both players cooperate, stay silent, they both receive a relatively light sentence, let's say 1 year each. If one player cooperates, stays silent, and the other defects, the defector goes free, 0 years, and the cooperator gets the maximum sentence, say 10 years. If both players defect, they both receive a moderate sentence, let's say 5 years each. From a rational decision-making perspective, both players are better off defecting, assuming they want to minimize their own sentence. This is because if player A defects and player B cooperates, player A goes free. If player A defects and player B defects, player A gets 5 years, but this is still better than cooperating and risking 10 years. Thus, the dominant strategy, the best course of action for each individual, regardless of what the other player does, is to betray the other. The same logic applies to player B, who will also be inclined to defect for the same reasons. Despite the fact that both players are better off cooperating, receiving only 1 year each, the rational self-interest of both leads them to defect, resulting in a worse outcome, 5 years each. The Pareto optimal outcome, the situation where both players are better off and no one can be made better off without making someone worse off, is mutual cooperation. However, because defection is the dominant strategy, both players end up worse off than if they had cooperated. The prisoner's dilemma illustrates the conflict between individual rationality and collective rationality, Cooperashing. In this setup, both players, acting in their own self-interest, undermine the potential collective benefit, leading to a less favorable outcome for both. The prisoner's dilemma presents a clear paradox. Rational individuals, acting in their own self-interest, are led to choose defection, which results in a worse outcome for both players than if they had cooperated. This challenges the assumption that rationality always leads to the best possible outcome. The prisoner's dilemma is often used to explain the tragedy of the commons, a situation in which individuals acting in their own self-interest can deplete or ruin a shared resource. For example, consider the case of overfishing. Each fisherman has an incentive to catch as many fish as possible to maximize their profit, even though this leads to the depletion of the fish population. If all fishermen cooperate and limit their catch, the fishery will thrive. But self-interested defection results in the collapse of the resource, leading to worse outcomes for everyone involved. The prisoner's dilemma encapsulates this tension between individual rationality and collective good. In the classic version of the prisoner's dilemma, the two players are unable to communicate with each other. This lack of trust or cooperation exacerbates the problem, as each player is uncertain about the other's actions. This mirrors many real-world situations where cooperation is needed to solve a collective problem, but lack of communication or trust leads to individual defection and ultimately suboptimal outcomes for everyone involved. In real life, the prisoner's dilemma is often played repeatedly, a version known as the iterated prisoner's dilemma. In this case, players encounter each other multiple times, which changes the dynamic of the game. The ability to punish defection in future rounds or reward cooperation creates an incentive for cooperative behavior. Strategies like tit for tat, where a player cooperates initially and then mirrors the opponent's previous move, have been shown to promote cooperation in repeated interactions. This highlights the fact that in repeated games, individuals can build trust and create incentives for mutual cooperation, which may lead to a better long-term outcome than defection in a one-off game. The iterated prisoner's dilemma helps explain how cooperation can evolve in environments where individuals interact multiple times. While the prisoner's dilemma is often viewed as a theoretical model, its principles have been applied to a variety of real-world scenarios, from business and politics to evolution and international relations. Here are a few examples. In business, companies often face the prisoner's dilemma when deciding whether to cooperate or compete. For example, consider two competing companies in an industry. If both companies cooperate, e.g. through price fixing or collaboration, they both benefit from higher profits. However, if one company defects, e.g. by undercutting prices, it can capture a larger share of the market, potentially harming the other company. But if both companies defect, they both end up with lower profits due to competition. Also, undercutting the profit margins can play a huge role. For example, if the customer has to increase prices, and if the paradox shows that while cooperation might benefit both companies, the self-interest of each company drives them toward defection, often resulting in lower profits for both. The prisoner's dilemma is often used to analyze arms races between nations. For example, two countries may be engaged in an arms race, where each country can either cooperate by reducing military spending, or defect by continuing to build weapons. If both countries cooperate, they both benefit from reduced military and spending and avoid the risks of escalation. However, if one country defects while the other cooperates, the defecting country gains an advantage. If both defect, they end up spending vast sums on military equipment without gaining any strategic advantage, leading to a suboptimal outcome for both. The prisoner's dilemma also applies to environmental issues, such as climate change. Countries face the choice of whether to cooperate by reducing emissions and investing in sustainable technologies, or defect by continuing to pollute and prioritize economic growth. If all countries cooperate, they can reduce global warming and ensure a sustainable future. However, if one country defects, it may gain a short-term economic advantage while the others suffer. The paradox highlights the challenges of global cooperation when individual nations are incentivized to prioritize their own interests over the collective good. The prisoner's dilemma highlights the challenges of achieving cooperation in situations where individual incentives push people toward defection. However, there are ways to resolve the paradox and encourage cooperative behavior. In real-world scenarios, communication and the building of trust can help overcome the dilemma. By fostering open dialogue and agreements between parties, individuals or nations can coordinate their actions and create mutually beneficial solutions. As noted earlier, in repeated versions of the game, cooperation can be encouraged through the use of strategies like tit for tat. In long-term relationships, individuals are more likely to cooperate if they know their actions will be reciprocated over time. Reputation and the prospect of future interactions can encourage individuals to cooperate, even when short-term defection seems tempting. Incentives for cooperation, such as rewards, and punishments for defection, such as sanctions, can also help resolve the prisoner's dilemma. By creating systems that encourage mutual cooperation and penalize selfish behavior, individuals or groups can align their interests and achieve better outcomes for all. Voting paradox. Imagine you are in a room with a group of people, all tasked with making a collective decision, such as choosing a leader or voting on a law. The decision is crucial to the group's future. Yet when it comes time to vote, something strange happens. Despite the best efforts to reach a fair and rational decision, the outcome is counterintuitive, and no one is satisfied. This is the essence of the voting paradox, where collective decisions, made through voting, do not always align with the individual preferences of the participants. It shows how rational individual choices can lead to irrational collective outcomes. A decision that seems fair and democratic may actually lead to results that do not represent the true will of the people. From voting systems to election outcomes, this paradox challenges the assumptions we have about rationality, fairness, and majority rule. Let's dive into the voting paradox and uncover why democratic decision-making can sometimes lead to unexpected and undesirable results. The voting paradox was first articulated by the French mathematician and philosopher Condorcet in the 18th century. Condorcet's jury theorem introduced the idea that voting systems could lead to paradoxical outcomes when individual preferences are aggregated to make collective decisions. The paradox arises when rational choices made by individuals do not necessarily result in a rational collective choice. The paradox was formalized further in the 20th century through the work of Kenneth Arrow, who developed Arrow's impossibility theorem in his book Social Choice and Individual Values, 1951. Arrow's theorem proved that no voting system can perfectly translate individual preferences into a collective decision that is fair and consistent under a set of seemingly reasonable conditions. In other words, when voting systems aggregate individual preferences to make a collective choice, they often produce results that fail to represent the true will of the people. The voting paradox continues to be a topic of discussion in political science, economics, and philosophy, especially when considering the limitations of democratic processes. It highlights the complexities of majority rule and raises important questions about the fairness and efficiency of voting systems in modern democracies. The voting paradox exposes the deep complexities and potential flaws in democratic decision-making. Despite its foundational role in modern societies, voting can lead to irrational outcomes that fail to reflect the true preferences of the electorate. This paradox illustrates how rational individual choices can aggregate into irrational collective decisions. Let's break down the paradox and examine its implications for elections, democratic processes, and social choice theory. The voting paradox occurs when individual preferences are aggregated into a collective decision, but the outcome of that aggregation doesn't reflect the preferences of the majority. More formally, it refers to situations where rational individual choices, based on personal preferences, lead to counterintuitive, irrational, or undesirable collective outcomes. One of the most well-known examples of the voting paradox is Condorcet's paradox. Condorcet's paradox occurs when 3 or more choices are on the table and the voters are asked to rank them. In such cases, it is possible for there to be no clear winner, according to majority rule. This happens when preferences are cyclical. For example, A is preferred to B is preferred to C, but C is preferred to A. In this case, there is no transitive preference across the candidates, and no majority rule can identify a clear winner. Let's look at a simplified scenario. Voter 1 prefers A greater than B greater than C. Voter 2 prefers B greater than C greater than A. Voter 3 prefers C greater than A greater than B. If we count the majority preferences between pairs, we get A versus B. Voter 1 prefers A over B. Voter 2 prefers B over A. Therefore, B wins. B versus C. Voter 1 prefers B over C, Voter 2 prefers B over C, and Voter 3 prefers C over B. Therefore, B wins. C beats A. Voter 1 prefers A over C, Voter 2 prefers C over A, and Voter 3 prefers C over A. Therefore, C wins. Thus, B beats A, B beats C, and C beats A, creating a cycle where no single option is preferred over all the others by a majority. This is a clear example of Condorcet's paradox. Despite individual preferences being clear, there is no consistent outcome based on majority rule. In voting systems, majority rule is often used to aggregate preferences. However, majority rule can lead to intransitive preferences, where A greater than B, B greater than C, but C greater than A, resulting in an irrational collective decision. This paradox highlights a fundamental flaw in majority-based voting systems, as they do not always lead to consistent and fair outcomes. One of the most famous contributions to the study of the voting paradox is Kenneth Arrow's impossibility theorem, which states that no voting system can satisfy all of the following desirable conditions simultaneously. Unanimity. If every individual prefers one option to another, the group's decision should reflect that preference. Non-dictatorship. The group's decision should not simply reflect the preference of a single individual. Independence of irrelevant alternatives. The choice between two options should not be influenced by the presence of a third, irrelevant option. Pareto efficiency. If everyone prefers one option to another, the group should prefer that option as well. Arrow's theorem shows that it is impossible to design a voting system that is fair, consistent, and representative in all cases. This creates a voting paradox because even though majority rule seems like the most democratic way to make decisions, it can often lead to irrational collective outcomes that fail to represent the true preferences of the population. The voting paradox has profound implications for democracy and collective decision-making. It forces us to question whether majority rule is the best system for aggregating preferences in situations of interdependence and group decision-making. The voting paradox illustrates that majority rule may not always reflect the true will of the people. When preferences are cyclical or intransitive, the majority's choice may not result in the most favored outcome for society. This highlights the potential inefficiencies and flaws in democratic systems that rely solely on majority voting. The paradox raises questions about the fairness of democratic decisions. If the collective outcome does not reflect the preferences of the majority of individuals, then how can we consider the outcome fair or legitimate? The paradox challenges us to think about alternative decision-making processes, such as consensus-based models or ranked choice voting, which may better account for the diversity of preferences and reduce the inefficiencies inherent in majority rule. The voting paradox extends beyond theoretical models to real-world situations. Here are some key examples where the paradox plays a role. In elections, the voting paradox often arises when multiple candidates are involved. Plurality voting, the system where the candidate with the most votes wins, can lead to outcomes where a candidate who does not have broad support across the electorate wins simply because the votes are split among multiple candidates. This can result in a situation where the winning candidate is not the most preferred candidate overall. In corporate governance, shareholder votes can lead to paradoxical outcomes when decisions are made through majority rule but do not necessarily reflect the true desires of the stakeholders. This can occur in situations where shareholders are forced to make decisions that affect the company's direction, but the voting system does not fully represent the interests of the minority shareholders or stakeholders. The voting paradox is also relevant in international relations, especially when decisions are made in multilateral forums like the United Nations or World Trade Organization. In these organizations, the voting system often leads to compromise solutions that do not fully satisfy any one nation's interests. The paradox arises when the majority decision does not align with the true interests of the collective group, or when the preferences of smaller nations are overlooked in favor of the larger powers. The voting paradox shows that majority rule and traditional voting systems can be flawed and inefficient. Several alternative systems have been proposed to address the paradox and create more fair and representative decision-making processes. Ranked choice voting, also known as instant runoff voting, allows voters to rank candidates in order of preference. If no candidate wins a majority, the candidate with the least votes is eliminated and votes are redistributed according to the voters' second choices, until a majority winner is found. RCV helps to avoid situations where a less popular candidate wins due to vote splitting. The Condorcet method seeks to find the candidate who would win in a head-to-head competition with every other candidate. This method tries to resolve the issue of cyclical preferences by identifying the Condorcet winner, the candidate who would defeat all others in pairwise voting. Deliberative democracy focuses on group discussions and reasoned deliberation to achieve a consensus-based decision, rather than relying solely on majority rule. This approach seeks to balance individual preferences with the collective good by fostering dialogue and compromise among all participants. Willpower paradox. Imagine you're sitting in front of a delicious dessert, knowing you should avoid it to stay healthy. You've made a promise to yourself to eat better, but the temptation is overwhelming. You tell yourself you won't give in, yet moments later you find yourself indulging. The paradox of willpower lies in our ability to make long-term plans and set goals, only to act against them in moments of temptation. This is the willpower paradox, a concept that explores the tension between self-control and short-term desires. Why do we struggle with maintaining self-discipline even when we know it's in our best interest? The paradox highlights the conflict between instant gratification and delayed rewards, and demonstrates how rational decision-making doesn't always align with our ability to follow through on long-term intentions. Let's dive into the willpower paradox and uncover why self-control is so difficult to maintain, and what can be done to resolve this tension between reason and desire. The willpower paradox is rooted in psychology, behavioral economics and decision theory, and has been discussed by philosophers, psychologists and economists for centuries. It stems from the struggle between instant gratification and delayed rewards, where people often make decisions that contradict their long-term goals due to the overwhelming nature of short-term desires. The paradox became more formally recognized in modern times through the work of psychologists such as Walter Mischel, whose famous marshmallow experiment, 1960S, tested children's ability to delay gratification. In this study, children were given a choice between one immediate marshmallow or two marshmallows if they waited 15 minutes. The experiment demonstrated that many children failed to resist the immediate reward, highlighting the challenge of self-control. Michel's work, along with later research in behavioral economics by scholars like Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, has shown how the struggle between short-term desires and long-term goals leads to irrational decisions. The willpower paradox is often linked to theories like hyperbolic discounting, where individuals disproportionately value immediate rewards over future benefits, making it difficult to act on long-term plans. Understanding the willpower paradox has significant implications for personal development, addiction treatment, and public policy, as it reveals the ways in which people often make decisions that undermine their own long-term interests. It also highlights the cognitive biases and emotional factors that influence self-control. The willpower paradox underscores the constant tension between our rational intentions and our emotional impulses. Although we often make decisions that favor long-term rewards, we frequently find ourselves succumbing to the pull of immediate gratification, even when it contradicts our self-imposed goals. This paradox has profound implications for our understanding of self-control, decision-making, and human behavior. Let's break down the paradox and explore its psychological and behavioral roots, along with its implications for decision theory and real-life situations. The willpower paradox arises when we attempt to act in our rational self-interest by making long-term plans or setting goals, but struggle to follow through because of short-term temptations. For example, you might set a goal to eat healthier, exercise more, or save money. You know these actions will benefit your health or finances in the long run, but when the opportunity for instant gratification arises, like eating a rich dessert or buying something impulsively, it becomes difficult to resist. In theory, self-control should be simple. Make a decision for the long term and follow through. But in reality, we often find ourselves in the grip of desire, unable to maintain the discipline necessary to meet our goals. Self-control, or willpower, is the ability to resist temptation and make decisions that align with long-term goals. However, willpower is not unlimited. Just like a muscle, it can become fatigued or depleted over time, especially when we are faced with multiple temptations throughout the day. Research by Baumeister et al. 1998 demonstrated that people who exerted willpower in one task were less likely to demonstrate self-control in subsequent tasks, highlighting the limited nature of willpower. This creates a situation where rational decision-making, based on long-term rewards, clashes with short-term desires. The willpower paradox suggests that even though we are aware of the long-term benefits of making rational choices, we often choose the short-term reward because it is immediately gratifying, leaving us feeling conflicted or guilty afterward. One of the central aspects of the willpower paradox is the conflict between immediate rewards, such as eating a piece of cake or buying a luxury item, and delayed rewards, such as improved health or financial stability. Hyperbolic discounting is a concept in behavioral economics that explains this conflict. It suggests that we tend to discount future rewards disproportionately, valuing immediate gratification far more than long-term benefits, even when the future reward is clearly more valuable. For example, while choosing to exercise today may lead to better health in the future, the pleasure of not exercising, such as staying in bed or watching TV, offers immediate gratification. In the moment, the value of immediate comfort outweighs the long-term benefits of exercise, even though we know the latter is the better choice. This leads to an irrational decision in the present that undermines our long-term plans. Several psychological factors contribute to the willpower paradox, making self-contraband particularly difficult to maintain. These include emotional impulses, cognitive biases, and time perception. When confronted with a temptation, emotions often overpower rational thought. Instant gratification, the immediate satisfaction of desires, can activate the dopamine system, making the temptation feel irresistible. This emotional response overrides our rational thought that the long term, the benefits of resisting temptation are far more rewarding. For instance, after a stressful day, the thought of indulging in a sweet treat or watching a favorite TV show may offer comfort, while the long-term health benefits of sticking to a diet or going to the gym feel abstract or distant. In these moments, emotional needs drive us to choose short-term pleasures over long-term benefits, despite knowing better. The present bias is a cognitive bias in which people disproportionately favor immediate rewards over future ones. This bias makes us more likely to make choices that provide immediate pleasure rather than delaying gratification for a better outcome in the future. The availability heuristic also plays a role in the willpower paradox. This is the tendency to rely on immediate experiences or memories to make judgments about future actions. If we've recently experienced pleasure from a behavior like eating junk food, we may overestimate the likelihood of experiencing similar satisfaction from the same action, leading us to act impulsively in the future. Temporal discounting refers to the human tendency to devalue rewards that are delayed in time. While we know that saving money or maintaining a healthy lifestyle will yield better long-term outcomes, the immediate rewards are often more tangible and appealing. For example, an impulse purchase feels more satisfying in the moment than saving for a future goal. This leads us to prioritize immediate gratification, even when we recognize that the long-term consequences may be detrimental. The willpower paradox is not just a theoretical concept, but plays out in everyday situations, particularly in the context of personal goals, health, and finances. Many individuals set long-term health goals, such as losing weight or improving fitness. They create workout routines, dietary plans, and set realistic expectations. However, when they face temptations, like a piece of cake, a night of binge-watching TV, or skipping the gym, They often choose the immediate reward over the long-term benefit, undermining their willpower and commitment. The paradox is evident when people fail to follow through on these goals despite their desire for better health. The short-term pleasure of indulgence is often too appealing, leading to a failure to act according to long-term objectives. Another common example of the willpower paradox is in the realm of financial planning. People often make plans to save money, pay off debt, or invest in their future. However, when faced with the temptation of spending, e.g. a new gadget or a vacation, they often opt to spend money in the present instead of sticking to their financial goals. The immediate gratification of purchasing something new outweighs the long-term benefit of saving, leading to a failure to build wealth. In cases of addiction, the willpower paradox can be particularly stark. Someone may want to quit smoking, drinking, or another harmful habit, but the immediate desire for the substance, e.g. nicotine or alcohol, often overrides the long-term goal of improving health or well-being. This creates a cycle where the person's rational intentions are continually undermined by their emotional impulses. The willpower paradox suggests that self-control is not just a matter of personal will, but is influenced by psychological factors and systemic challenges. While willpower may be limited, there are ways to improve self-control and make decisions that align with long-term goals. One effective strategy for overcoming the willpower paradox is pre-commitment, the act of locking yourself into a decision before you're faced with temptation. For example, you might set up automatic savings accounts where money is taken out of your paycheck before you can spend it. Similarly, placing unhealthy foods out of sight or blocking distracted websites can help prevent immediate temptations from interfering with long-term goals. Practicing mindfulness, the ability to stay present in the moment and resist impulsive urges, can help reduce the power of temptation. By becoming more aware of your desires and impulses, you can pause and reflect before giving in. This process can be particularly useful in reducing emotional impulses and enhancing self-regulation. Having a support system or accountability partner can help strengthen willpower and keep you on track with your goals. When you share your intentions with someone else, you are more likely to stay committed to your long-term objectives. Group support can also make it easier to resist temptations, as the collective effort helps reinforce self-control. Cool tropics paradox. Picture this. Tropical regions around the world are typically associated with warm, abundant sunlight, lush forests, and fertile soil, everything needed for agriculture and economic growth. Yet, despite these natural advantages, many tropical countries remain among the poorest and least developed in the world. How can it be that the world's most resource-rich regions seem to lag behind in terms of economic development? This is the essence of the cool tropics paradox, a phenomenon where tropical countries, despite having the natural conditions for thriving agriculture, often fail to translate this advantage into economic prosperity. While it seems intuitive that a hot, humid climate would foster growth and productivity, the paradox challenges our assumptions by showing how climate, geography, and economic development are not as straightforward as they appear. The cool tropics paradox raises questions about the complex relationship between natural resources, climate conditions, and economic outcomes, offering a fascinating exploration into the realities of development in the tropics. Let's dive into this paradox and explore why tropical regions often struggle despite having the perfect environment for growth. The cool tropics paradox is a concept discussed in both economic geography and development studies, aiming to explain why tropical regions, despite having seemingly favorable climatic conditions, struggle to achieve the same levels of economic growth as temperate regions. The paradox gained prominence in the early 2000s, particularly in research that explored the link between geography and economic performance. The paradox is rooted in the idea that tropical regions, typically rich in natural resources such as fertile land, abundant water, and access to sunlight, should logically excel in industries like agriculture. Farming in the tropics can be highly productive, with crops like coffee, sugar, and bananas thriving in the warm climate. However, research led by economists like Jeffrey Sachs and William Easterly showed that many tropical regions have not been able to translate these advantages into economic prosperity. One key hypothesis is that tropical climates present unique challenges that temperate zones do not face, such as disease, poor soil quality, and high humidity. Additionally, the high prevalence of diseases like malaria, dysentery, and tuberculosis in tropical areas has historically hindered human development. Over time, these factors have contributed to lower economic output, despite the favorable conditions for agriculture. The cool tropics paradox suggests that climate and geographical location are just one part of the equation for economic success. Social, political, and historical factors play a critical role in determining the level of economic development in a given region. The cool tropics paradox offers a unique challenge to conventional wisdom about the relationship between geography, climate, and economic development. While tropical regions often possess favorable conditions for agriculture, many such regions remain economically stagnant, prompting researchers to look beyond natural resources as the sole determinant of economic success. Let's break down the paradox and its implications for development theory, climate's influence on growth, and economic outcomes. The cool tropics paradox describes the situation where countries in tropical regions that should, in theory, have an abundance of natural resources, struggle to convert these advantages into economic growth. The paradox can be framed as follows. Tropical regions typically have access to fertile land, abundant sunlight, and warm temperatures, which should theoretically allow for highly productive agriculture. Despite these favorable natural conditions, many tropical countries, especially in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Central America, lag behind in terms of economic development, showing lower levels of GDP, education, and standard of living than countries in temperate climates. The paradox challenges the assumption that resource-rich regions naturally translate into economic prosperity. It suggests that there are deeper factors at play that prevent tropical countries from realizing the full potential of their natural endowments. While warm, humid climates offer ideal conditions for crop growth, they also create significant challenges. For example, high humidity promotes the spread of diseases like malaria and dengue fever, which have historically had a devastating impact on populations in tropical regions. These diseases not only reduce life expectancy but also drain resources that could otherwise be used for economic development. Moreover, the tropical climate makes it difficult to store food for long periods. This problem, coupled with issues like soil degradation, deforestation, and unsustainable farming practices, prevents agriculture from being as profitable as it could be, limiting the overall economic potential of these regions. One of the most significant aspects of the cool tropics paradox is the persistent issue of tropical diseases. Diseases like malaria, dysentery, and yellow fever have hindered population growth and human development in tropical regions for centuries. These diseases not only caused high mortality rates, but also distracted governments from focusing on long-term economic policies. In the past, colonial powers had limited knowledge and resources to address these diseases, and even in the post-colonial era, economic instability and poor healthcare infrastructure have kept many tropical regions from tackling these health challenges effectively. While the cool tropics paradox suggests that tropical regions should have an economic advantage, the reality is much more complex. Here are some of the reasons why geography alone does not dictate economic development. The quality of a country's institutions, such as its legal system, property rights, and political stability, plays a significant role in determining its economic success. Weak institutions in tropical regions, due to historical factors such as colonial rule, political instability, and corruption, have contributed to the failure to capitalize on natural advantages. For instance, Africa's tropical regions are rich in natural resources like oil, minerals, and fertile land. But many countries have struggled with poor governance and conflict, preventing them from effectively managing these resources for long-term economic development. In some cases, resource wealth has led to the phenomenon of the resource curse, where countries are dependent on raw materials and neglect other sectors of the economy, such as education, infrastructure, and manufacturing. In temperate regions, technological innovation and industrialization have historically driven economic growth. However, many tropical regions have faced barriers to technology adoption and innovation due to economic isolation, limited access to education, and lack of infrastructure. These factors make it difficult for tropical countries to develop the kind of high-value industries and technology-driven economies that temperate countries enjoy. Even in agriculture, where tropical countries have a natural advantage, the lack of modern farming techniques and irrigation systems can limit productivity. Without the proper infrastructure and access to capital and technology, tropical countries may fail to benefit fully from their natural resources. Tropical countries are often located in remote areas with limited access to global markets. In addition to the challenge of disease and agriculture, the physical geography of the tropics, such as dense forests, mountains, and islands, can make transportation and trade difficult and expensive. This raises the costs of exporting goods and acquiring necessary imports, further limiting economic growth. Human capital is one of the most important determinants of economic growth. Despite the natural advantages of tropical regions, many countries in these areas face chronic educational and health challenges that prevent them from reaching their economic potential. While some tropical regions have access to abundant natural resources, they often lack the educational systems necessary to train the workforce to meet the needs of a modern economy. The cooler, temperate regions, in contrast, have historically had more access to higher education, fostering innovation and skilled labour. Without access to quality education and training programs, tropical regions struggle to develop skilled workers who can advance the economy through sectors like technology, engineering, and medicine. As discussed earlier, diseases like malaria and dysentery severely impact the health of populations in tropical regions, reducing life expectancy and overall productivity. Even in regions where healthcare has improved, the economic burden of disease remains a significant obstacle to growth. Healthy populations tend to have more productive workforces, but the health challenges in tropical regions continue to undermine this potential. Given the various factors that contribute to the cool tropics paradox, there are strategies that can be used to address these challenges and help tropical regions realize their economic potential. Improving governance and institutional quality is critical for fostering sustainable economic development in tropical regions. This involves reducing corruption, improving legal frameworks, and ensuring political stability. Stronger institutions are necessary to manage natural resources, create long-term plans, and support economic growth. Investing in education and healthcare is essential for building a skilled workforce and a healthy population that can contribute to economic productivity. Countries in the tropics should focus on universal education, skilled labor training, and improving healthcare access to reduce the impact of diseases and improve overall living standards. Improving infrastructure, such as transportation networks, energy access, and telecommunications, can help tropical regions become more connected to the global economy. Additionally, investing in technology and agricultural innovation can help improve productivity and reduce the dependency on raw resource extraction. The cool tropics paradox reveals that while climate and geography play an important role in economic development, they are just one part of a much more complex puzzle. Factors such as institutions, governance, education, health, and infrastructure must all be considered in the pursuit of sustainable economic growth. By addressing the challenges posed by tropical diseases, improving governance, and investing in human capital and infrastructure, tropical regions can unlock their full economic potential. However, overcoming the paradox requires a multifaceted approach that goes beyond simply relying on the natural advantages of the tropics. Irresistible force paradox. Imagine a situation where two powerful forces are set into motion, each unstoppable in its own right. One is the irresistible force, a force so powerful that nothing in its path can withstand it. The other is the immovable object, something so solid, so unyielding, that nothing can move it. Now, picture these two forces meeting in the middle. What happens when an unstoppable force encounters an immovable object? The irresistible force paradox asks just that. What happens when two absolute forces collide, both of which seem to defy all limits? This paradox challenges our understanding of absolute power and limits, suggesting that when faced with two conflicting absolutes, we are left in a state of logical contradiction. Can such forces even exist? What does it mean for the nature of power, force, and limits? This paradox raises deep questions about conflict, resolution, and the very nature of infinity. Let's explore the irresistible force paradox, a thought experiment that pushes the boundaries of logic, power, and human understanding. The irresistible force paradox is an ancient philosophical dilemma that has been discussed in various forms by philosophers, theologians, and logicians throughout history. Its origins can be traced back to classical Greek philosophy, where questions about the nature of infinite power, absolute force, and logical consistency were common themes. The paradox was most famously introduced as a thought experiment to explore the limits of absolute power and the logical contradictions that arise when two absolutes collide. The paradox plays with the concept of an irresistible force, something that cannot be stopped by any means, and an immovable object, something that cannot be moved by any force. The fundamental question that arises from this paradox is, what happens when these two absolutes meet? The paradox has been used to explore various ideas in metaphysics, philosophy of power, and theology. In some interpretations, it challenges the idea of omnipotence, whether it is even possible for an entity to possess absolute infinite power without contradictions arising. Theologians have used the paradox to discuss the limits of divine power, asking whether it is logically possible for God to be both all-powerful and unable to create logical contradictions. Philosophers have used the paradox to illustrate the limitations of absolute reasoning and finite systems. In modern times, the irresistible force paradox is often discussed in the context of conflict theory, power dynamics, and logical reasoning, emphasizing how two seemingly incompatible absolutes can lead to logical deadlocks in our understanding of power and authority. The irresistible force paradox is a thought experiment that forces us to confront the limits of absolute power and logical coherence. While the paradox might appear trivial at first glance, it opens up deeper questions about the nature of infinity, absolute forces, and power structures. Let's break down the paradox, explore its philosophical implications, and consider its real-world applications. The irresistible force paradox is set up with two hypothetical entities. The irresistible force, a force so powerful that nothing can stop it, is an absolute entity that moves without impediment, regardless of the obstacles in its path. The immovable object, an object so unmovable that nothing can move it. It represents absolute resistance, a state of being that is impervious to any force or action. The paradox arises when these two absolutes meet. The question is simple, yet profound. What happens when the irresistible force encounters the immovable object the paradox creates? By logical conflict. If the irresistible force exists, then by definition it must be able to move anything, including the immovable object. But if the immovable object exists, then by definition it cannot be moved by any force, including the irresistible one. This creates a contradiction in the concept of absolute power and limitless force, as both seem to be logically incompatible. One way to view this paradox is through the lens of infinite power. The irresistible force represents infinite power in motion, while the immovable object represents infinite resistance. But when these two forces meet, it becomes impossible to determine which one should prevail, because they are both infinite and therefore beyond the bounds of conventional logic. The paradox raises the fundamental question of whether both of these absolutes, the irresistible force and the immovable object, can exist simultaneously. If one exists, then the other must logically cease to exist. In other words, the existence of one renders the other impossible. This forces us to consider whether absolute forces, like infinite power, can even exist in the real world, or whether they are merely conceptual contradictions. The irresistible force paradox is a way to explore the limits of absolute power and omnipotence. It asks whether it is possible for any being or entity to possess unlimited power without encountering logical contradictions. If an entity is truly omnipotent, can it create a situation in which it is unable to act, such as creating an irresistible force and an immovable object that cannot coexist? This question challenges our understanding of power. If we accept that absolute power can exist, we must also accept that it may come with inherent limits or logical boundaries. The paradox implies that there may be inherent contradictions within the concept of absolute power. For example, omnipotence may not mean being able to do anything, but rather being able to do anything that is logically possible. The paradox also raises questions about the nature of infinite entities, whether infinity in terms of power or resistance can be coherently understood. Infinity in this case is a conceptual rather than a practical reality. If both the irresistible force and the immovable object are infinite, their interaction would be a logical impossibility. This suggests that infinity may be a conceptual limit rather than a tangible reality. The paradox of infinity has implications in various philosophical debates, including those concerning the nature of the universe, cosmology, and theology. Just as infinity is difficult to grasp in the physical world, the paradox suggests that absolute power or absolute resistance may also be ungraspable in a coherent, real-world sense. Another philosophical implication of the irresistible force paradox is the idea that conflicting forces cannot coexist in harmony. In human terms, this may relate to situations where power struggles or opposing forces seem to be in a deadlock, leading to an inability to resolve conflict. In politics, for example, stubborn resistance and unwavering power can lead to stalemate situations, where neither side is able to achieve their goal. The paradox invites us to think about power dynamics and how opposing forces interact in a system. Whether on a personal, societal, or global level, it suggests that in conflicts of absolute power or extreme ideologies, the resolution may be elusive or impossible. While the irresistible force paradox is often discussed in theoretical and philosophical contexts, its principles can also be applied to real-world situations, particularly in politics, society, and conflict resolution. In the realm of politics, the irresistible force paradox can be used to examine situations where opposing ideologies or power structures seem to be in direct conflict. For example, in international relations, superpowers like the United States and China may both possess vast economic and military power. Each side may see itself as an irresistible force, and the other as an immovable object, leading to a stalemate where no side can fully achieve its goals. In domestic politics, the paradox can represent situations where political parties or interest groups are at a standstill, each holding on to uncompromising positions that prevent meaningful progress. Here, the paradox illustrates the inability to move forward when two equally powerful forces are at odds. On a psychological level, the irresistible force paradox can apply to internal conflicts within the self. A person may face a situation where their desires, representing the irresistible force, come into conflict with their values or goals, representing the immovable object. In such situations, the individual may feel torn between instant gratification and long-term discipline, leading to self-doubt and indecision. For example, a person who wants to lose weight may face the irresistible force of a craving for junk food, while their immovable object is their commitment to a healthier lifestyle. This internal conflict can feel like a deadlock, where both forces exert equal pressure, preventing any movement in either direction. The paradox can also be seen in the context of global conflicts and arms races. Two nations with equally destructive nuclear arsenals might find themselves in a situation where each side is an irresistible force and the other is an immovable object. The mutual assured destruction doctrine is based on this principle, where both sides know that any attempt to outpace the other would lead to catastrophic consequences for both. Here, the paradox reveals the stalemate that arises from absolute power facing absolute resistance. To resolve the irresistible force paradox, we must reconsider our assumptions about absolute power. The paradox suggests that absolute forces cannot exist in isolation without creating contradictions. Instead, power is often relative. The interaction of forces creates dynamic systems rather than static absolutes. One way to resolve the paradox is to accept that omnipotence or absolute power is not about creating logical contradictions, but about exercising power within the constraints of reason and coherence. Omnipotence could mean the ability to do anything possible, including refraining from creating logical paradoxes. Another resolution lies in the concept of cooperation rather than opposition. Instead of two opposing forces, power can be seen as something that is best exercised in harmony. In the context of global politics or personal conflict, cooperation between strong forces can lead to mutually beneficial outcomes rather than a deadlock. Moving rows paradox. Imagine a crowded theatre where the rows of seats are arranged in a neat, orderly fashion. However, something strange happens. Every time someone moves forward, everyone in the row ahead of them shifts by one seat. You could have endless rows of people, and no matter how far they move, the next person will always end up ahead of you, making it feel like you are stuck in an infinite loop. This is the essence of the moving rows paradox, a fascinating thought experiment that explores how infinite processes can create a situation where even simple actions seem to lead to paradoxes of movement and space. The paradox questions the concept of infinity, showing how seemingly simple changes in order can lead to complex, counterintuitive outcomes when applied to infinite systems. How can infinite movement result in something that appears simultaneously orderly and chaotic? Let's explore the moving rows paradox and uncover the surprising implications it has for our understanding of space, infinity, and order. The moving rows paradox is a modern thought experiment that ties into the broader field of infinity paradoxes, particularly those related to infinite sets and the manipulation of space. While not as well known as paradoxes like Zeno's paradoxes or the Hilbert Hotel, it builds on similar themes regarding the concept of infinity and the counterintuitive results that arise when infinite processes are involved. The paradox is typically framed using a metaphor of rows of people in a theatre or seats on a bus, where everyone in the row ahead moves forward by one seat at regular intervals. The paradox challenges our understanding of infinite movement, highlighting how simple rules can create complex or even seemingly contradictory situations when applied to infinite systems. Though it has not been formally discussed by famous philosophers or mathematicians, it shares many of the key features of infinity paradoxes, such as recursive movements, infinite regress, and the resolution of space. The paradox often leads to questions about how infinity interacts with time, space, and order, much like Zeno's paradoxes, which deal with the conflict between infinite divisions and finite distances. Philosophers and mathematicians have used the moving rows paradox to provoke deeper thought about the nature of infinity and the paradoxical results that arise when it's applied to systems that should appear straightforward in finite terms. And the paradox continues to be a powerful tool for understanding the limits of spatial organization, order, and infinite processes. The moving rows paradox highlights a fascinating aspect of infinity and spatial arrangements that defy conventional logic. It draws upon the concept of infinite processes and how sequential movements can lead to seemingly paradoxical outcomes. While simple in premise, the paradox reveals deep insights about order, infinity, and space. Let's break down the paradox and examine its implications in detail. To understand the moving rows paradox, let's start with a simple setup involving infinite rows of seats in a theatre. Suppose there are infinitely many rows, and in each row an infinite number of seats. The seats are occupied by people, and the following rule is in place. Every time someone moves forward, everyone in the row ahead of them moves forward by one seat. In other words, for every individual action, say a person in row 5 moving forward by one seat, everyone ahead of them in rows 1-4 must also move forward by one seat. Let's say we start by moving the first person in the first row forward by one seat. This seems like a simple change, a single move forward in a well-ordered structure. But as they move forward, the rest of the people in the rows ahead of them must also shift by one seat. This action creates a domino effect of movement that seems to reorder the entire system. At first, everything seems fine, but as the process repeats and becomes recursive, strange things begin to happen. Since there are infinitely many rows, this seemingly simple movement of one person eventually affects the entire system in ways that are not immediately obvious. Each subsequent movement seems to perpetuate an infinite cycle where people keep shifting forward, making it appear like no one ever reaches their final destination. An odd situation for something that seemed so well ordered. As more people shift forward, the paradox becomes clear. Even though the system is set up to be ordered, the result is a never-ending series of movements that doesn't lead to a clear conclusion. The infinite nature of the rows creates an infinite regress, where the act of moving forward creates more shifting, and this shifting perpetuates the paradox, making it seem like no one ever truly gets anywhere. One of the key features of the moving rows paradox is the idea of infinite movement, and how it creates a logical deadlock. At first, the system seems simple. Each person just moves forward one seat. But when applied to an infinite system, the rules become counterintuitive. The paradox is rooted in the infinite division of space. In a finite scenario, a movement as simple as moving forward one seat is straightforward, but when applied to infinite rows, it becomes infinitely recursive. This infinite division of space leads to the question, how can infinite movements happen in a finite time frame? This mirrors similar paradoxes, like Zeno's paradoxes, where infinite divisions of a finite distance create contradictions. In the case of the moving rows paradox, the act of moving forward can never truly finish because infinite actions cannot be completed in a finite amount of time. The infinite regress created by moving forward means that no individual action can ever fully resolve the paradox. In the paradox, no individual reaches their destination despite the infinite actions. Even though everyone is moving forward, no one seems to get closer to the end because the motion itself is perpetual. The finality of each action becomes a non-terminating loop, which can be seen as an impossibility. This suggests that, in infinite systems, actions that should appear finite and deterministic lead to never-ending processes. This highlights a broader issue with infinite processes. They challenge our intuition about movement, progress, and order. In real-world situations, we expect actions to produce tangible results, but in an infinite system, no result ever seems to be final. The moving rows paradox brings to light the limits of our understanding of infinity. and how it interacts with space. Infinite regress suggests that some systems may never come to a final state, which challenges the assumption that all actions will eventually result in completion. In mathematics, this paradox is closely related to infinite sets and recursive processes. Just as the Hilbert Hotel paradox illustrates the paradoxical nature of infinity in terms of space, where infinite rooms can always accommodate more guests, the moving rose paradox explores how infinite processes create a situation where progress is perpetually deferred. A critical element of the paradox is the role of time in an infinite system. Infinite processes create situations where time appears to be moving forward, but no final conclusion is reached. The infinite duration of movement suggests that time, when applied to an infinite system, becomes a paradoxical entity itself. Time can appear to pass, but since each individual move perpetuates the cycle, no true end state is achieved. This leads to questions about how infinity interacts with time in real-world systems. The moving rose paradox also illustrates the limitations of linear thinking in decision-making and progress. In situations where progress is seen as sequential, like a series of movements, infinite recursion shows how the linear view of progress can fail in more complex systems. The paradox suggests that non-lunar thinking and non-terminating systems may require a new understanding of how we conceive of success and outcomes. The moving rose paradox extends beyond thought experiments and can be seen as a metaphor for several real-world phenomena. The paradox can be applied to bureaucratic systems where procedures or paperwork seem to multiply, creating an endless loop of processes. In many organizations, progress is hindered by endless steps that do not lead to a definitive outcome. This is akin to the paradox, where actions are taken, but the final goal never seems to be reached. The paradox can also be applied to discussions of economic growth. In the context of infinite growth in a world with finite resources, economic systems may seem to continually push forward, but there is no true end to the growth process. The paradox illustrates how unlimited expansion may face contradictions and inefficiencies in the long run. On an individual level, the paradox can represent personal growth, where individuals set goals and make incremental progress, yet, because each step leads to a new set of tasks, the final state of success or completion can feel elusive, as personal growth seems to be a never-ending process. Paradox of place paradox? Imagine standing in a room and you're told that you are exactly in the center of the room. Now, picture a friend standing next to you, also told the same thing. Both of you are in the exact center of the room. But wait, if you're both in the center, then how can there be two centers? This is the essence of the paradox of place. It challenges our understanding of space, location, and identity. How can two individuals, or even objects, occupy the same place at the same time without causing confusion? The paradox of place delves into the complexities of spatial relationships, identity, and location, raising questions about how we perceive and define space in a world full of overlapping realities. This paradox forces us to reconsider how we view the nature of place, asking whether it's possible for identical spaces to exist for different individuals, or whether our understanding of location is inherently flawed. Let's explore the paradox of place, which challenges our most basic assumptions about the nature of physical space and individuality. The paradox of place has its roots in philosophical discussions surrounding space and location, drawing heavily from the work of ancient philosophers and more recent thinkers in the fields of metaphysics and ontology. The idea that multiple objects can share the same location at once without contradiction challenges many traditional notions of space and identity. Philosophers such as Aristotle and Descartes explored the idea of absolute space, the concept that objects can exist in a defined place, but that place is independent of the objects themselves. These early thinkers viewed space as something external, something that exists independent of the objects within it. However, the idea of the paradox of place arises from the subjective experience of location, how we perceive space, and whether it can truly be occupied by more than one object or person at once. The paradox became more prominent in modern philosophy and theories of relativity, with Albert Einstein's groundbreaking work on space-time. Einstein's theory of relativity shows that space is not just a fixed container for objects, but is instead part of a dynamic system influenced by mass and motion. This challenged our previous assumptions about the immutability of space and led to further questions about how place and identity are interconnected. The paradox of place forces us to reconsider the notion of physical reality, and whether it can be neatly defined, or whether our understanding of space and identity is more fluid than we think. The paradox of place presents a philosophical challenge to our understanding of space, location, and identity. It asks whether two objects or individuals can occupy the same space simultaneously without causing confusion. It forces us to think about the nature of place. Is it something fixed and separate, or is it an evolving dynamic concept that can overlap and shift? Let's break down this paradox, explore its implications, and examine how it forces us to rethink the boundaries of space and existence. The paradox of place begins with the fundamental idea that a place or location is where an object, person, or event is situated within the physical world. We typically think of space as being divided into distinct places, with each place being occupied by a specific object or individual. However, the paradox arises when we ask, can two objects occupy the same place at the same time? Consider a room with a specific size and shape. We might think that the center of the room is a unique position, defined by its spatial coordinates. But what happens if two people are both standing in the center of the room at the same time? According to traditional spatial thinking, the center can only be one place, but now there are two people occupying the same place. Does this make sense, or does it create a contradiction? How can two distinct identities exist in the same location without causing logical confusion? The paradox of place touches on the issue of identity and location. If two people are in the same place, does that mean their identities are merged? How do we reconcile this overlap of space and identity? In the physical world, we rarely encounter situations where two identical spaces are occupied by different individuals or objects. However, the paradox forces us to question whether it is possible for place and identity to coexist without creating contradictions. The paradox also challenges our traditional understanding of fixed versus fluid space. If space is viewed as absolute, meaning it is a static container in which objects are placed, then the idea of two objects in the same place seems impossible. But if we view space as relative, as something that is shaped by the objects within it, then it becomes possible that the same place can be perceived differently by different observers, allowing for a more dynamic understanding of space. One of the key issues raised by the paradox of place is the relationship between space and identity. When we think about where something is, we typically associate a specific object with a specific place. However, if two objects can occupy the same place, how do we reconcile the idea that identity is tied to location? In traditional physical terms, identity is usually tied to the physical presence of an object in space. If you occupy a particular place, you are thought to be linked to that place. For example, if you are in the center of a room, the center becomes your location. But if another person occupies the same place, does that mean they share the same identity as you? Or does the place itself become less important? The paradox can also be applied to personal identity. If two people share the same location at the same time, does that challenge the uniqueness of their individual identities? For example, in a crowded space like a subway or concert hall, many people are physically occupying the same general area, yet each maintains their distinct identity. Does this mean that space itself does not define identity, or does it suggest that personal identity is not fully dependent on a fixed location? The paradox of place extends beyond physical space into the realms of theology and metaphysics. The idea of multiple beings or entities occupying the same place has important implications for our understanding of divinity and omnipresence. In theology, the paradox of place is often used to discuss the concept of omnipresence. If a deity is omnipresent, present everywhere at the same time, then how can this being be located in any specific place? The paradox raises the question of whether a divine being can occupy every point in space simultaneously without dissolving into multiple identities. The omnipresence of a deity suggests that identity and place are not bound by the same rules as ordinary objects, opening the door to a more abstract understanding of space. The paradox also touches on metaphysical questions about the nature of location itself. If two entities can occupy the same space at the same time, what does it mean for the nature of physical reality? The paradox of place suggests that location may not be a static entity tied to specific objects, but could be something more fluid and relative. This opens up the possibility that identity and space are interconnected in ways that traditional logic cannot fully explain. While the paradox of place is largely theoretical, Its implications are seen in real-world phenomena, particularly in quantum mechanics, social behavior, and organizational systems. In quantum mechanics, the idea of particles being in multiple places at once is known as superposition. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle suggests that particles like electrons do not have a definite position until they are observed, allowing them to exist in multiple locations simultaneously. This is a real-world example of the paradox of place at the subatomic level, where the very concept of location is fluid and dynamic. On a societal level, the paradox of place can be seen in social spaces like cities, crowds, or workplaces. In these spaces, many people share the same physical location but retain their individual identities. For example, at a concert or a sporting event, the space may be filled with thousands of people, yet each person still occupies their own personal space and maintains a distinct identity. This paradox challenges our understanding of how we define space and identity in social contexts. In organizational systems, the paradox can apply to shared workspaces, offices, and meeting rooms. In an open office, many individuals might occupy the same physical space, but each person is still working within their own identity and responsibility. This example highlights how space can be shared without diminishing the individuality of the people within it. To resolve the paradox of place, we must reconsider our assumptions about the nature of space and location. Rather than viewing space as a fixed, static container, the paradox of place suggests that space may be more relative and dynamic. Instead of being a definite and exclusive location, space may be more like a shared resource where multiple entities can coexist and be in the same place at the same time. The paradox also invites us to rethink how identity is tied to place. Perhaps identity is not solely dependent on physical location, but is instead shaped by context, relationship, and experience. In a world where space is not fixed, personal identity may become something more fluid and interconnected with others. Another way to resolve the paradox is to view place as a conceptual framework rather than a physical boundary. In this model, space is understood as a shared dimension where multiple identities can coexist without contradiction. This would allow the paradox to be resolved by understanding space as something more abstract, defined by relationships and interactions rather than strict boundaries. Paradox of the grain of millet paradox. Imagine you have a small pile of millet grains. One by one, you begin adding more grains to the pile, and each time you add another, it still looks like a small pile. No noticeable change. But then, at some point, you add another grain, and suddenly the pile is big enough to be considered a heap. This is the essence of the paradox of the grain of millet. At what point does a small pile of grains transform into a heap? If you keep adding grains one at a time, where does the transformation happen? This paradox challenges our understanding of thresholds and gradual change. It illustrates how small incremental changes can eventually lead to a conceptual leap, even though each individual change seems insignificant. The paradox forces us to consider how we define things like heaps, piles, and boundaries when the changes are so gradual that no single step seems to make a difference. Let's explore the paradox of the grain of millet, where accumulation leads to a point of conceptual transformation, raising questions about categories, boundaries, and how we understand change. The paradox of the grain of millet is closely related to Sorites paradoxes, also known as the paradox of the heap. The term Sorites is derived from the Greek word for heap, and the paradox dates back to ancient Greek philosophy, specifically Eubulides of Miletus, 4th century BCE. Eubulides used this paradox to illustrate the problem of defining when a gradual accumulation of small changes results in a significant conceptual transformation. The paradox of the grain of millet, or similar small units, are needed to form a heap. If you add a grain, you have a slightly larger pile, but no one would call it a heap. Gradually adding more grains doesn't seem to change the nature of the pile until a certain threshold is reached, but pinpointing when that threshold occurs is difficult. The Sorites paradox has been a subject of debate in philosophy and logic for centuries, often used to explore issues related to vagueness, continuity, and conceptual boundaries. The paradox of the grain of millet serves as a concrete example of how we grapple with these gradual changes and thresholds, especially when our language and categories fail to account for small, incremental shifts. It also raises important questions about borderline cases, where we struggle to categorize things that seem to fall into a grey area. The paradox of the grain of millet is a compelling example of how gradual changes can eventually result in a conceptual leap that challenges our understanding of boundaries and categories. It forces us to question how we define things like a heap or a pile, and explore how the process of accumulation leads to significant changes that don't seem to occur with any single step. Let's break down the paradox, its philosophical implications, and how it sheds light on the nature of gradual change and thresholds. The paradox of the grain of millet involves a pile of millet grains or any other small unit. The paradox is set up with the following scenario. You begin with a small pile of grains. Gradually, you add one grain at a time. At each step, the pile grows slightly larger, but it is still not perceived as a heap. Eventually, after adding enough grains, the pile reaches a point where it is unquestionably a heap. But the paradox asks, how many grains does it take for the pile to transform from not a heap into a heap? Each individual grain added doesn't seem to make a significant difference. If a pile of 999 grains isn't a heap, adding a single grain seems like it shouldn't suddenly turn the pile into a heap, but at some point it does. The paradox highlights the difficulty of pinpointing thresholds when changes occur gradually. The central issue in the paradox of the grain of millet is the gradual nature of the change. The paradox forces us to reconsider the way we think about continuity and discreteness. In many real-world situations, changes happen gradually, and yet we categorize things in discrete terms. For example, a pile of anything can gradually turn into a heap or a mountain depending on the context, but we struggle to define exactly when the transformation happens. This gradual process can be seen as a continuum, a process where the change is so subtle that we can't easily define the precise point at which one thing becomes another. This mirrors issues we often encounter in language and classification. One of the most important philosophical aspects of the paradox of the grain of millet is its relation to vagueness. Vagueness arises when there is no clear-cut boundary between categories, like what counts as a heap versus what doesn't. The paradox of the grain of millet is a specific instance of the broader Sorites paradox. The Sorite paradox asks how many grains of millet, or sand, or anything else are needed to form a heap. If we add one grain at a time, we encounter a problem of vagueness. At what point does a small pile become a heap? It's difficult to pinpoint a clear boundary where the transition happens, because the process is gradual. Philosophers have long debated how to handle these borderline cases, situations where the classification of something is unclear or ambiguous. This vagueness is not limited to physical objects, but extends to conceptual categories like baldness, richness, or tallness. For example, if someone has just a few hairs on their head, are they bald or not? The vagueness of such categories is part of the paradox of the grain of millet, where the issue is not about the exact quantity of grains, but about the conceptual shift from one category to another. The paradox raises the question of whether we can ever have precise categories for things that change gradually. How do we define when something like a heap or a pile exists, or when something becomes something else? The moving threshold that defines the boundary is elusive, and the paradox suggests that our use of categories in everyday life might be less definite than we would like to believe. The paradox of the grain of millet has profound implications for how we think about boundaries, categories, and conceptual change. It pushes us to reconsider our assumptions about the way we classify things and how we understand the transition from one category to another. One of the philosophical questions raised by the paradox is how we understand continuity. Gradual changes over time often do not fit neatly into discrete categories. While we might think of a heap as a specific category, the change from a small pile to a heap occurs gradually, with no single step clearly defining the transition. The paradox suggests that our thinking about categories may need to account for continuous processes rather than fixed boundaries. The paradox also forces us to reconsider how we use language to describe reality. When we talk about heaps, we may be thinking about an abstract category, but in reality the world consists of continuous phenomena that don't always fit into clear-cut categories. Our reliance on conceptual distinctions, such as heap, vs pile, may not accurately reflect the fluid nature of the world around us. In response to the Sorites paradox, philosophers have explored solutions involving fuzzy logic, a system where concepts are not binary but exist in degrees. In fuzzy logic, categories like heap or pile could be viewed as existing on a spectrum, where the degree to which something is a heap depends on how many grains are in the pile. Instead of a sharp line dividing piles from heaps, we might recognize that there are gradual shifts and that fuzzy categories can better reflect how we experience the world. The paradox of the grain of millet is not just a thought experiment, it has real-world applications in areas such as decision-making, policy and social behavior. In economics, gradual accumulation can lead to significant change over time, even when no single event seems large enough to make a difference. For example, small changes in a person's income over time might not significantly affect their lifestyle at first, but over many years, these small changes can result in dramatic shifts in wealth or quality of life. This mirrors the gradual shift in the paradox, where incremental changes eventually lead to major transitions. In the realm of social policy, the paradox applies to issues like poverty or climate change. Small changes in policy or behavior may not seem to have an immediate impact, but over time they can lead to major social shifts. Addressing poverty, for example, involves many small actions. Increasing the minimum wage, providing education, healthcare and social services that add up to larger changes in the long run. The paradox also applies to the environment. Global warming and environmental degradation occur as a result of incremental changes over time. Each small act of pollution or resource depletion seems inconsequential in isolation, but collectively they have the power to alter the environmental landscape dramatically. The paradox of the grain of millet challenges us to reconsider how we categorize the world and how we deal with gradual change. To resolve this paradox, we may need to embrace fuzzy logic, continuity, and the understanding that concepts are not always discrete, but are often gradual. By adopting fuzzy logic, we can better understand how gradual accumulation leads to conceptual shifts. Instead of expecting a sharp, clear line between categories, we can recognize that some transitions are smooth and continuous, with no single moment defining the shift. The paradox suggests that boundaries in our thinking are less fixed than we might believe. In real life, many categories are fluid and subject to gradual change. Instead of looking for rigid definitions, we can acknowledge the gradual process of categorization and how small shifts can lead to large-scale transformations. Algol paradox. Imagine you are looking at a distant star in the night sky, and you see it flickering in a way that seems random. But this star is special. It is a variable star whose brightness changes in predictable intervals, and you can measure these intervals. Now, here's the catch. The star you are observing is not the same star as it was when you first saw it. Its light is 8 years old by the time it reaches your eyes. This is the essence of the Algol paradox, a phenomenon that highlights the complexities of time, observation and knowledge. It brings into question how we perceive the past, the present and the future, especially when the very object we observe is undergoing change across vast distances in time and space. The paradox challenges our understanding of knowledge, observation and perception, showing how the act of observing an event in one moment may be based on information that is old, misleading, or even contradictory. Let's explore the Algol paradox, where time and knowledge collide, and perception doesn't always reflect the reality we believe it to be. The Algol paradox takes its name from Algol, also known as the demon's star, a variable star in the constellation Perseus that exhibits an irregular brightness. The star's light fluctuates in a regular pattern, with a period of about 2.87 days. Algol is what's known as an eclipsing binary star system, where one star periodically passes in front of the other, causing the observed brightness to decrease and then increase. The Algol paradox arises from the unique nature of light travel and how our observations of distant stars are always based on past events. Because the light from Algol, or any distant star, takes time to reach us, often years or centuries, the star we observe is not the star as it is right now, but rather the star as it was when the light left it. This creates a temporal disconnection between the actual events happening in space and what we perceive. For example, when we observe Algol's brightness changing every 2.87 days, we are actually observing events that took place several years ago, depending on how far the star is from Earth. The paradox challenges the nature of reality and time. If our perception of a distant event is based on outdated information, how can we truly know the present? What does it mean to observe something that is constantly changing, but we only see it through the lens of past data? The Algol paradox raises questions about knowledge, observation, and our ability to fully understand events happening at a distance. The Algol paradox provides a fascinating lens through which we can explore the concepts of time, space, observation, and knowledge. It highlights the gap between what is actually happening in the universe and what we perceive to be happening, especially when events occur at vast distances that affect our temporal perception. While Algol itself is a relatively well-studied star system, the paradox is broader and raises philosophical questions about the very nature of reality and time. Let's break down the paradox, its implications, and how it forces us to reconsider our understanding of perception and knowledge. The Algol paradox begins with the fact that light traveling from a distant star takes time to reach Earth. Algol, located about 93 light-years from Earth, is an eclipsing binary star system, and we observe its brightness fluctuating in a predictable pattern. However, the paradox occurs because light takes time to travel. The light that reaches us from Algol today actually left the star years ago, in this case, approximately 8 years ago. Changes in brightness? When we observe changes in Algol's brightness due to the eclipsing binary system, temporal gap between reality and observation. The main issue with the Algol paradox is the temporal disconnect that arises from light travel time. When we look at a star, we are observing the past state of that star. This disconnect challenges our understanding of now and then, as we are constantly receiving information that is historically delayed. We can never fully know the present of an object that is far away, as we are always observing its past. This raises philosophical questions about knowledge and reality. If we can never perceive the true present of an object far away, then how can we claim to know what is happening right now? Are we always living in a world of delayed knowledge? The Algol paradox thus highlights the limitations of perception when it comes to understanding events that are removed from us by both space and time. One of the central philosophical questions raised by the Algol paradox is the nature of time. Time, as we commonly experience it, is a linear progression, and we perceive events as they happen. However, in the context of distant objects, time becomes non-linear. We observe an event that took place in the past, but we treat it as if it were happening in the present. This creates an illusion of simultaneity, where events that are separated by time seem to happen at once, even though they are temporally disjointed. This challenges our understanding of what it means for something to be happening now, and whether we can truly experience the present in a universe that operates on light-years of delay. The Algol paradox also challenges our theories of knowledge. When we observe something, whether it's a star, a distant galaxy, or any object, we rely on sensory data to form an understanding of reality. However, if the data we receive is based on past events, can we claim to truly know what is happening in the present? The paradox suggests that knowledge is always mediated by time, and that our understanding of the world is inherently delayed. This raises deeper questions about the nature of truth, and whether we can ever truly know anything in its immediate state. Is all knowledge, to some extent, always about the past? If so, can we ever experience true immediacy in our perception of events? The Algol paradox points to the limits of observation and how we define reality. Our knowledge of the universe is always mediated by light, time, and distance. No matter how far we look, we are always looking at a delayed version of reality. This creates a distance between objective reality and subjective perception, forcing us to reconsider how we define the nature of existence and the passage of time. The Algol paradox is directly relevant to astronomy and cosmology. In these fields, we are constantly looking at distant stars, galaxies, and cosmic phenomena whose light has taken millions or even billions of years to reach Earth. As a result, much of our knowledge of the universe is based on historical data, and we can never observe the universe as it truly is in the present moment. This paradox underscores the challenges faced by astronomers in interpreting the state of the universe, as we are always observing events from the past. When we look at the cosmic microwave background radiation, for instance, we are seeing a snapshot of the universe from approximately 380,000 years after the Big Bang, an event that occurred around 13.8 billion years ago. Thus, much of our understanding of the universe is based on delayed perception. The Algol paradox is also relevant in the context of space exploration and communication as we send probes and messages to distant planets. The time it takes for signals to reach their destination creates a delay between the intent and observation. This delay is particularly important in interplanetary communication, where a signal sent from Earth to Mars can take anywhere from 13 to 24 minutes, depending on the relative positions of the planets. This delay forces us to rethink how we manage and interpret data from space exploration. In a more terrestrial context, the Algol paradox can be applied to global communication systems. The speed of light limits how quickly information can be transmitted across the globe, and in some cases, delays in communication can result in temporal discrepancies. Whether in finance, news reporting, or international diplomacy, the lag in real-time data can create misunderstandings and inefficiencies. The paradox emphasizes the need to account for these delays in our modern, interconnected world. To resolve the Algol paradox, we must rethink how we understand time, knowledge, and reality. Several potential resolutions suggest themselves. One way to resolve the paradox is to embrace the relativity of time. Just as Einstein's theory of relativity shows that time is not an absolute constant but is shaped by gravitational fields and relative motion, the Algol paradox forces us to recognize that our perception of the universe is always relative to where we are in time and space. Instead of expecting immediate knowledge, we must accept that all observation is inherently delayed by the constraints of light travel. We can redefine immediate knowledge to mean knowledge within a certain time frame. Understanding that while we may never know the exact present of a distant object, we can know its past state and make predictions about its future state based on that data. This allows us to live with the temporal lag and work with it, rather than expecting true immediacy. Faint young sun paradox. Imagine a time nearly 4 billion years ago when the Earth was young. The sun, still in its early stages, was much less bright than it is today. In fact, the sun's luminosity was only about 70–80% of what it is now. Yet, life thrived on Earth, with liquid water, oceans, and early forms of life. How could this be? The faint young sun paradox asks how early Earth could have remained warm enough to support liquid water, despite the sun being so much weaker than it is today. According to the laws of physics, the sun's lower luminosity should have meant that early Earth would be frozen, unable to maintain the conditions necessary for life. Yet, geological evidence suggests that life did indeed exist during this time, and the Earth was not a frozen ice ball. This paradox challenges our understanding of climate stability, solar evolution, and the history of life on Earth. Let's explore the faint young sun paradox and examine the mechanisms that may have allowed early Earth to maintain conditions favorable for life despite the weak sun. The faint young sun paradox was first recognized in the 1970 when astrophysicists and climatologists realized that early Earth could not have been as warm as geologic evidence suggested, given the weak state of the sun in its early years. According to the solar evolution theory, the sun has gradually increased in brightness over time, with its luminosity being only around 70–80% of today's level during the early stages of the Earth's history, some 3.8 billion years ago. The paradox arises because climate models of Earth during this time suggest that a sun with only 70% of its current output would not provide enough heat to keep the planet warm enough to support liquid water, which is considered essential for life. Yet geologic evidence from ancient rocks, such as sedimentary layers, indicates that Earth had liquid water on its surface and that life was beginning to develop. This contradiction led to the identification of the faint young sun paradox, which has since become a central problem in climate science, planetary evolution, and astrophysics. The paradox has prompted numerous hypotheses about how Earth could have maintained a stable climate in the face of a weaker sun, and has deep implications for our understanding of how planets, including exoplanets, could support life in different stages of solar evolution. The faint young sun paradox is a fascinating challenge to our understanding of solar physics, planetary climate, and the conditions necessary for life. The paradox forces us to reconsider the relationship between the sun's luminosity, Earth's climate, and the development of life over geological time. Let's break down the paradox, explore its scientific implications, and discuss the various hypotheses that have emerged to explain how early Earth could have remained warm enough to support life despite the weak sun. The faint young sun paradox stems from the understanding that the sun has not always been as bright as it is today. In fact, the sun's luminosity has gradually increased over time as it has evolved through different stages of its stellar life cycle. When the Earth formed about 4.5 billion years ago, the sun was in a younger, cooler state, known as the pre-main sequence phase, and its luminosity was much lower, about 70–80% of its present output. However, geological evidence from ancient rocks shows that early Earth had liquid water, which is necessary for the development of life. This raises the central question: how could Earth support liquid water if the sun was so faint? The sun, like other stars, began its life with a lower luminosity. As it aged, it gradually became brighter as part of its natural stellar evolution. Early in its history, the sun's energy output was not sufficient to maintain the warmth needed to keep Earth's surface above freezing, especially given the Earth's relatively low atmospheric pressure and composition. According to models of solar evolution, the sun's luminosity increased at a rate of about 0.1% per 100 million years. This means that early Earth should have experienced significantly lower temperatures than we see today. If the sun were only emitting 70–80% of its current brightness, the Earth's surface should have been covered in ice, making it impossible for life to form or thrive. To understand the paradox, we need to look at climate models that predict the Earth's temperature based on the sun's luminosity. When scientists ran these models using the sun's weaker early luminosity, they found that Earth should have been in a state of perpetual global ice, akin to what we would now call a snowball Earth. These models show that in the absence of other factors, Earth would have been too cold to support the development of life. However, this prediction contradicts geological evidence that suggests early Earth had liquid water and a temperate climate. This contradiction is the crux of the faint young sun paradox. One of the leading explanations for the faint young sun paradox is the idea that greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere played a crucial role in trapping heat and keeping the planet warm, despite the sun's lower luminosity. In this hypothesis, the early Earth would have had much higher concentrations of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, CO2, methane, CH4, and water vapor, H2O, which would have trapped the heat in the atmosphere and kept Earth's surface temperatures above freezing. These gases would have created a stronger greenhouse effect, which compensates for the weaker sunlight by enhancing the planet's ability to retain heat. The high levels of CO2 may have come from volcanic outgassing, where volcanoes released gases trapped in Earth's mantle. Additionally, the early Earth likely had a more active hydrological cycle, with a greater concentration of water vapor in the atmosphere, contributing to the warming effect. The greenhouse effect would have been more pronounced in the early Earth's atmosphere due to the lack of modern oxygen and the abundance of gases that are more effective at trapping heat. With this stronger greenhouse effect, Earth could have remained warm enough to support liquid water, even if the sun was much less bright than it is today. Another factor that may have contributed to Earth's temperature stability is the planet's orbital configuration. The early Earth's orbital eccentricity, the shape of its orbit around the sun, might have been different from what it is today. It's possible that early Earth had a more circular orbit, reducing the amount of seasonal variation in sunlight and helping to maintain a more uniform temperature across the planet's surface. Additionally, Earth's tilt and axial rotation may have contributed to the climatic stability required to prevent the planet from freezing. Some models suggest that Earth may have been in a state of equilibrium, where the solar insulation, the amount of sunlight reaching Earth's surface, was balanced by the greenhouse effect. In this scenario, even though the sun was weaker, the orbital dynamics and atmospheric conditions created a stable climate that allowed for the presence of liquid water. Another potential factor in the faint young sun paradox is the concept of albedo, which refers to the reflectivity of the Earth's surface. Early Earth may have had a much lower albedo, a darker surface that absorbed more sunlight, rather than reflecting it back into space. For example, early Earth might have had oceans or dark volcanic land masses that absorbed sunlight efficiently, preventing the planet from cooling down too quickly. The low albedo would have helped the Earth retain more heat, especially in combination with the greenhouse gases. In addition to the sun's energy, Earth's internal geothermal heat might have played a role in maintaining a habitable climate. Geothermal energy, which comes from the decay of radioactive isotopes and the heat left over from Earth's formation, could have provided additional warmth to the planet's surface. Although geothermal heat alone would not be enough to maintain Earth's temperature, it could have contributed to the overall balance of heat, especially during periods of low solar energy. Interestingly, some scientists have proposed that Earth might have experienced periods of global glaciation, known as the snowball Earth hypothesis, even while liquid water existed. In this scenario, Earth would have been covered by ice, but pockets of liquid water, perhaps in the oceans or near hydrothermal vents, could have provided the necessary conditions for life to develop and survive. This hypothesis suggests that life could have been isolated from the harsh conditions of the ice-covered surface, possibly in the oceans or in subsurface environments warmed by geothermal activity. The faint young sun paradox has significant implications for the study of exoplanets, planets orbiting other stars. When scientists look for habitable planets, they often focus on stars with luminosities similar to the Sun's. However, the paradox suggests that exoplanets around dimmer stars, such as red dwarfs, could still support life if they have the right combination of atmospheric conditions, greenhouse gases, and orbital dynamics. The faint young sun paradox reminds us that habitable conditions depend not only on the star's brightness, but also on a variety of planetary factors that contribute to a stable climate. The faint young sun paradox highlights the complexity of climate, solar evolution, and the development of life on Earth. While it initially appears to be a contradiction between the weak early sun and the presence of liquid water, modern scientific research has provided several plausible explanations, from greenhouse gases and orbital dynamics to albedo changes and geothermal heat. The paradox challenges our understanding of planetary climates and emphasizes the importance of dynamic systems in maintaining habitable conditions. As we continue to explore the early history of Earth and search for habitable exoplanets, the lessons learned from the faint young sun paradox will guide our understanding of how life can thrive in the most unlikely of conditions. Olbers paradox. Imagine standing outside on a clear, dark night. You look up at the sky and see thousands of stars twinkling, forming constellations and scattering light across the vast expanse. But what if I told you that every point in the night sky should be just as bright as the sun? According to the Olbers paradox, the night sky should be completely bright because, in an infinite, eternal universe filled with stars, every line of sight would eventually land on the surface of a star, leading to an all-encompassing glow. And yet, the night sky remains dark. This is the heart of the Olbers paradox. Why, in an infinite universe full of stars, does the night sky not shine brighter than day? The paradox challenges our understanding of the universe, light, and cosmology, forcing us to confront questions about the structure and evolution of the cosmos. Let's explore the Olbers paradox and uncover the solutions that help explain why, despite the infinite number of stars, the sky is still dark. The Olbers paradox is named after the German astronomer Heinrich Wilhelm Olbers, who first formally described the paradox in 1823. However, the question of the night sky's darkness had been raised before Olbers, with earlier astronomers like Johann Lambert and Thomas Digges discussing the implications of an infinite universe. The paradox arises from the assumption that if the universe is infinite and eternal, and if it is filled with an infinite number of stars, then, no matter where you look in the sky, your line of sight should eventually hit the surface of a star. This would mean that the sky should be bright, even brighter than the sun, because the stars would be so numerous that there would be no dark spaces. Despite this expectation, the night sky remains dark, and this contradiction came to be known as Olbers' paradox. For centuries, astronomers and cosmologists were puzzled by this apparent contradiction between what should be and what is observed. Various solutions to the paradox have been proposed, ranging from the nature of the universe's expansion to the finite age of the universe. Olbers' paradox was one of the key questions that spurred the development of modern cosmology, influencing the ideas of Edwin Hubble, who discovered the expansion of the universe in the 1920s, and later contributions from Albert Einstein and others who developed the theory of general relativity and the concept of the Big Bang. The Olbers' paradox has become a key question in cosmology that explores the relationship between light, the structure of the universe, and our understanding of space. The paradox rests on the assumption that in an infinite, static universe full of countless stars, the night sky should be blindingly bright. Yet we observe that it is dark. Let's break down the paradox, explore the scientific explanations, and discuss how modern cosmology addresses this fundamental question. The paradox begins with a seemingly simple premise. If the universe is infinite and eternal and filled with countless stars, then why does the night sky appear dark? If we imagine the universe as a static, unchanging space, filled with stars that have existed for an eternity, the sky should be uniformly bright. Here's why. Infinite stars. In an infinite universe, there are infinite stars spread out across space. If every line of sight from Earth were to eventually encounter a star, there would be no empty space in the sky and no darkness. Unchanging stars. If stars are eternal, then they should be present at every point in space. Over time, they would accumulate, leading to a bright sky with no gaps in the light from stars. Brightness. Each star, being a massive ball of burning gas, emits light in all directions. As light travels through space, it should illuminate every point in the sky. Therefore, if you look at any point in the sky, you should eventually see a star, and the sky should appear bright. So, why doesn't this happen? If the universe is truly infinite and static, the sky should not be dark. It should be so bright that day and night would be indistinguishable, because every point in space would be filled with starlight. The paradox forces us to reconsider our assumptions about the nature of the universe. If the universe is infinite and eternal, why do we observe a dark sky? If stars are scattered throughout the cosmos, why do we experience nighttime darkness? The paradox suggests that our understanding of the universe is incomplete, and it prompts important questions about the structure of space, the finite nature of the universe, and the limits of our observations. One of the most important solutions to Olber's paradox is the concept of an expanding universe. The idea that the universe is not static, but is instead expanding, fundamentally alters our understanding of the paradox. In the early 20th century, Edwin Hubble discovered that galaxies are moving away from us, a result known as the Hubble's law. This discovery showed that the universe is expanding, meaning that the distance between galaxies is increasing over time. If the universe is expanding, the stars that are farther away from Earth are moving away from us, causing their light to be shifted to longer wavelengths through a phenomenon known as redshift. As the universe expands, the light from distant stars and galaxies is stretched, making it shift toward the red end of the spectrum. Over vast distances, this redshift can become so pronounced that the light from distant stars is no longer visible to the human eye, effectively rendering the night sky dark. This is why we don't see light from all the stars in the universe. Their light is redshifted beyond the visible spectrum, making them invisible. Moreover, the expansion of the universe means that light from stars in distant galaxies is becoming diluted as space itself stretches. As a result, the intensity of light from distant stars decreases over time, making the night sky darker than we would expect in an infinite, static universe. Another solution to the Olber's paradox is the idea that the universe is not eternal, but rather had a beginning. The Big Bang theory posits that the universe began as a hot, dense point around 13.8 billion years ago, and has been expanding ever since. Because the universe has a finite age, we can only see the light from stars and galaxies that have had time to reach us. In a universe with a finite age, there has been only a limited amount of time for light to travel across the cosmos. This means that there are regions of the universe from which light has not yet reached us, making the night sky appear dark. The concept of a finite universe with a finite history resolves the paradox by acknowledging that not all regions of the universe are accessible to us in terms of light, especially when the universe is still expanding. Another factor that may contribute to the darkness of the night sky is the absorption of light by interstellar dust. In our own galaxy and in other galaxies, there are regions of dust and gas that absorb and scatter light. As light from distant stars travels through the galaxy, much of it may be absorbed by these particles, preventing it from reaching our eyes. This interstellar medium absorbs light across the electromagnetic spectrum, reducing the intensity of light from distant stars. While the universe is full of stars, much of the light emitted by them is absorbed by dust and gas in the space between us and the stars, contributing to the darkness of the night sky. Finally, the solution to Olber's paradox lies in the concept of the observable universe. Even if the universe is infinite, we can only observe a finite region of it. The light from stars in distant regions has not had time to reach us due to the finite speed of light and the expansion of the universe. This means that our perception of the universe is limited by the observable universe, which has a boundary determined by the distance light has travelled since the Big Bang. Beyond this boundary, there are stars and galaxies that are simply too far away for their light to ever reach us. The resolution of the Olber's paradox is tied to our understanding of the universe's evolution. The discovery that the universe is expanding, combined with the finite age of the cosmos, fundamentally changes our conception of the universe. The paradox illustrates how the universe has evolved over time, and how its structure today is different from what it was in the past. The expanding universe explains why we do not observe infinite light, and why the night sky appears dark, despite the universe being full of stars. The paradox has led to deeper insights into the nature of cosmology, cosmic inflation, and the eventual fate of the universe. The Olbers paradox also ties into broader questions about the structure of the universe. While the paradox is solved by the expanding universe, the mysterious nature of dark matter and dark energy remains an important issue. These unseen components make up a large portion of the universe's mass-energy content, influencing its expansion. Understanding the relationship between dark matter, dark energy, and the observable universe can help us answer deeper questions about the cosmic landscape. The Olbers paradox is a classic puzzle in cosmology, but its resolution lies in our understanding of the finite age and expansion of the universe. As the universe expands, light from distant stars is shifted, diluted, and absorbed, creating a dark night sky. The paradox highlights the importance of time and space in shaping our understanding of the universe and forces us to rethink the nature of reality, light, and knowledge. The Olbers paradox ultimately reveals a universe that is dynamic, expanding, and full of mysteries yet to be explored. GZK paradox. Imagine cosmic rays, the most energetic particles in the universe, racing toward Earth at nearly the speed of light. These high-energy particles have traveled across vast stretches of space, carrying with them immense energy from distant galaxies. But, according to the GZK paradox, they shouldn't even be able to reach us. The GZK paradox refers to a strange phenomenon in astrophysics. Ultra-high energy cosmic rays, which are thought to be capable of reaching Earth, should lose their energy long before they get here. These particles, traveling through the universe, will collide with background radiation, such as the cosmic microwave background, CMB, and lose energy due to a process known as pair production. This phenomenon should prevent ultra-high energy cosmic rays from traveling across long distances. Yet, we observe that these particles do indeed reach Earth, leading to the paradox. The GZK paradox challenges our understanding of cosmic rays, energy conservation, and the limitations of the universe, asking why such high-energy particles don't lose their energy as expected. Let's explore the GZK paradox, where the universe's most energetic particles seem to defy the laws of physics and cosmic limits. The GZK paradox takes its name from the Greisen-Zatspen-Kuzmin cutoff, a phenomenon first predicted in the early 1960s by Kurt Greisen, Vladimir Zatspen, and Gennady Kuzmin. These physicists showed that cosmic rays with extremely high energy should lose energy when interacting with the cosmic microwave background, CMB, a faint radiation permeating space. The theory suggests that when cosmic rays with energies greater than a certain threshold, about 5x 10 to the power of 19 eV, travel through space, they collide with CMB photons, producing particles like electron-positron pairs, and thus losing energy in the process. This would prevent such particles from reaching Earth or traveling very far. However, in the 1990s, the Fly's Eye experiment and later the Pierre Auger Observatory detected ultra-high energy cosmic rays with energies far beyond the GZK cutoff, reaching energies of nearly 10 to the power of 20 eV, leading to the GZK paradox. These findings raised questions about the limits of cosmic ray travel, and suggested that our current understanding of energy loss over long distances might be incomplete or flawed. The GZK paradox remains a central topic in the field of astrophysics, particularly when studying cosmic ray origins and the universe's large-scale structure. It challenges our understanding of the fundamental laws of physics, such as energy conservation and particle interactions at extreme scales. The GZK paradox is a perplexing problem in modern astrophysics that involves the behavior of ultra-high energy cosmic rays. These particles, originating from distant galaxies or possibly active galactic nuclei, travel across vast stretches of space, often at near-light speeds. However, according to theoretical models, the interactions between these high-energy cosmic rays and the cosmic microwave background, CMB, should prevent them from traveling over such large distance. The paradox lies in the observation that despite these theoretical limitations, we observe ultra-high-energy cosmic rays reaching Earth. Let's break down the paradox, explore its scientific implications, and discuss the theories that have emerged to explain why ultra-high-energy cosmic rays are able to survive long journeys through space. The GZK paradox revolves around the concept of ultra-high-energy cosmic rays. These are particles with energies greater than 10 to the power of 19 eV, much higher than the energies of typical cosmic rays. The question is, how can these particles with such extreme energy travel across vast cosmic distances and still arrive at Earth? According to the Greisen-Zatsepin-Kuzmin GZK cutoff, particles with energies above 5x 10 to the power of 19 eV should interact with cosmic microwave background, CMB radiation, a faint radiation that fills the universe. The theory suggests that when high-energy cosmic rays encounter CMB photons, they undergo a process called pair production, where the energy of the cosmic ray is converted into electron-positron pairs, which reduces the energy of the cosmic ray. In this model, the cosmic ray should lose so much energy in these interactions that it cannot travel the vast distances needed to reach Earth. It's expected that at these energies, the cosmic rays would decay before traveling far beyond a distance of around 100 megaparsecs, about 300 million light-years, creating a cutoff in the observable range of cosmic rays. This is where the paradox comes in. We still observe ultra-high-energy cosmic rays reaching Earth, some even with energies greater than the GZK cutoff. The fundamental mechanism behind the GZK cutoff is pair production. This process occurs when a high-energy photon, such as those in the CMB, interacts with a high-energy cosmic ray. The collision produces an electron-positron pair, and the energy of the cosmic ray is shared between the particles. This results in a loss of energy for the cosmic ray, limiting how far it can travel before losing all its energy. Theoretically, cosmic rays with energies above the GZK threshold should lose energy as they travel through space, particularly when they interact with CMB photons. The GZK cutoff predicts that ultra-high-energy cosmic rays should not be able to travel across distances greater than 100 megaparsecs, since they would have lost so much energy through pair production that they would no longer be detectable by Earth-based observatories. The discovery of cosmic rays with energies above the GZK threshold was first made by the Fly's Eye experiment in 1991, and later by the Pierre Auger Observatory. These experiments detected cosmic rays with energies up to 10 to the power of 20 eV, far exceeding the expected GZK cutoff. The fact that these particles are reaching Earth presents a major paradox. If they were losing energy as expected, how are they able to travel such vast distances without decaying? This detection has become a significant challenge for current models of cosmic ray physics and has led to various attempts to explain the GZK paradox. One potential solution to the GZK paradox is that these ultra-high-energy cosmic rays might originate from sources that are closer to Earth than expected, such as active galactic nuclei, AG, or gamma-ray bursts, GRs. These sources are capable of accelerating particles to extremely high energies, potentially producing cosmic rays with energies well above the GZK cutoff. If these ultra-high-energy cosmic rays are coming from nearby sources within 100 megaparsecs, then the energy loss through pair production would be much less significant, and the cosmic rays could travel across the relatively short distances before losing significant amounts of energy. In this case, the GZK cutoff would still apply at greater distances, but the observed cosmic rays might be coming from relatively close sources that are not subject to the same energy loss. Another possible solution is that magnetic fields in intergalactic space could play a role in guiding or focusing cosmic rays, allowing them to travel further than expected. Strong magnetic fields could deflect the path of cosmic rays, making it more difficult for them to interact with CMB photons in the way that models predict. This would reduce the energy loss through pair production, allowing cosmic rays to travel further before they are depleted. While the role of cosmic magnetic fields is still an area of ongoing research, this idea suggests that our models of cosmic ray interactions might need to account for more complex dynamics, such as the effect of magnetic deflections and interactions with galactic and intergalactic fields. A more speculative solution to the GZK paradox involves the possibility of new physics beyond our current understanding of particle interactions. Some physicists have proposed that the pair production process may not operate as predicted at ultra-high energies. This could imply that the laws of physics we use to model cosmic ray interactions are incomplete, and that new, undiscovered interactions or particles may be involved in the process. The idea of new physics is tantalizing, but it remains speculative. However, if proven correct, it would open up entirely new fields of research in astrophysics and particle physics. reshaping our understanding of cosmic ray propagation and energy loss across intergalactic distances. Another possibility is that cosmic rays might be interacting with other forms of background radiation beyond the cosmic microwave background. For example, if cosmic rays collide with ultraviolet or X-ray photons in intergalactic space, the resulting energy loss could be different from what is predicted for CMB photon interactions. This might alter the predicted energy loss rate, and could help explain how high-energy cosmic rays are able to travel across vast distances without decaying. The GZK paradox has profound implications for the study of cosmic ray origins. If ultra-high-energy cosmic rays can travel across vast distances, it suggests that their sources may be much more varied and dynamic than previously thought. The discovery of nearby sources, such as active galactic nuclei and gamma-ray bursts, has already revolutionized our understanding of where cosmic rays come from. The GZK paradox points to the need for more detailed studies of galactic environments, supermassive black holes, and other extreme astrophysical phenomena. The paradox also has implications for particle physics and the fundamental laws of nature. If ultra-high-energy cosmic rays are able to defy the energy loss predicted by the GZK cutoff, it could indicate the presence of new, unknown physical processes. This could prompt new experiments aimed at understanding how particles behave at the highest energies, and whether our understanding of high-energy astrophysics needs to be revised. The GZK paradox also challenges our cosmological models, particularly those related to the expansion of the universe. The existence of ultra-high-energy cosmic rays traveling over large distances suggests that the universe's structure and dynamics may be more complex than simple models of expansion and cosmic evolution suggest. The GZK paradox remains one of the most intriguing problems in astrophysics. While several potential solutions have been proposed, including nearby sources of cosmic rays, the role of magnetic fields, and even the possibility of new particle physics, the paradox continues to challenge our understanding of the universe. As research into cosmic rays, galaxies, and high-energy particles continues to evolve, the GZK paradox will undoubtedly remain a key area of exploration, pushing the boundaries of both astrophysics and particle physics. Paradox of youth. Paradox. Imagine a young person, full of energy, ambition, and the belief that they have all the time in the world. Now, imagine an older person, looking back at their life with nostalgia, realizing how quickly time passed, despite thinking they had endless years ahead of them. The paradox of youth explores the striking contrast between how time feels in youth versus in older age. When we are young, we often perceive time as infinite and our potential as limitless. We focus on the present and rarely think about the future, but as we grow older, we become acutely aware of the limited time we have left and the rapid passage of time. The paradox lies in this shift in perception, how something that once felt eternal becomes fleeting, and how youth itself is defined by the very ignorance of its own impermanence. This paradox forces us to confront the relationship between time, youth, and our sense of urgency. Let's explore the paradox of youth, where the illusion of infinite time and potential in youth fades into the reality of life's transience as we age. The paradox of youth is not a formal philosophical paradox, but rather a concept that has appeared in literature, art, and psychology throughout history, often addressing the tension between youth's perception of time and the inevitable passage of life. This paradox is tied to the concept of time and how humans perceive it at different stages in life. In ancient philosophy, thinkers like Heraclitus discussed the idea that time and change are constant, yet how individuals experience these forces differs depending on perspective and age. In the modern era, psychological studies and sociology have shown that younger people tend to view time as something abundant, often leading to carelessness about the future. As people grow older, they develop a heightened sense of time and often experience regret about missed opportunities, the passing of time, and the limits of their lifespan. In literature, authors like William Shakespeare in his sonnets, particularly Sonnet 12, explore the fleeting nature of youth and the realization that time inevitably leads to decay and death. This theme resonates in various cultures and has shaped narratives in everything from romanticism to modern existentialism. The paradox of youth offers a universal experience across generations, reminding us of the gap between our subjective experience of time and the objective truth that time never stops. It highlights how youth's sense of immortality often collides with the inevitable march of time, creating a deeper understanding of human nature, regret, and reflection. The paradox of youth addresses the temporal perception we have at different stages in life. While youth is often associated with hope, energy, and potential, it is also paradoxically defined by the ignorance of time's passing. The paradox arises from the contrast between how time feels during youth versus later stages of life. Let's dive deeper into the paradox, exploring how this perception of time evolves over a lifetime, the psychological mechanisms at play, and the philosophical implications of the passage of time. At its core, the paradox of youth revolves around the perception of time. For young people, time seems like an endless resource. Childhood and adolescence are often marked by a sense of freedom and lack of urgency, where the future feels distant and unimportant. The experience of time is mostly lived in the present, and future consequences seem less significant than immediate desires and goals. When we are young, time feels infinite because we have yet to experience the limitations of aging and the uncertainty of the future. This creates a sense of immortality, a belief that time will always be available to us for achieving goals, experiencing life, and making decisions. Youth often feels like a time to explore the world without a deep understanding of the finite nature of existence. This perception is reinforced by biological and psychological factors. The brain's development during youth prioritizes immediate rewards over long-term planning, leading to an optimistic sense that time can be stretched and that there will always be enough time to accomplish things later in life. For younger people, living in the present moment takes precedence. Decisions are often made based on immediate pleasure or short-term outcomes, rather than considering the long-term consequences. This is not to say that young people are unaware of the future, but they often perceive the future as something distant, a far-away destination that is not yet relevant. This mindset is also evident in how young people view success, failure, and relationships. They may approach life with a sense of invincibility, believing they have all the time in the world to make mistakes, learn, and grow. This sense of time abundance creates a paradox. While time feels unlimited, youth's lack of awareness about time's fleeting nature leads to missed opportunities and regrets later in life. As individuals age, there is a shift in their perception of time. The transition from youth to adulthood often brings a deeper awareness of time's limitations and a more urgent need to plan for the future. The paradox of youth becomes clearer as individuals move into middle age and beyond, experiencing the realization that time is no longer endless. When individuals enter adulthood, especially in their late 20s and 30s, they begin to feel the weight of time. This is the point when people realize that they have only so many years to achieve their goals, pursue careers, or build families. The sense of immortality fades as time becomes something that must be carefully managed. For many people, this is when regret sets in. Looking back on their younger years, they may feel they wasted time, or didn't take advantage of opportunities when they had the energy and ambition to do so. This loss of time becomes a source of frustration and nostalgia, as people wish they could go back and make better choices or take more risks when they were younger. A significant aspect of the paradox of youth is the midlife crisis, a time when individuals become acutely aware of the passage of time and the limited future ahead of them. Many people in midlife reflect on their past choices, wondering what they might have done differently if they had known how quickly time passes. This crisis often leads to major life changes, whether in careers, relationships, or personal pursuits, as people attempt to reclaim time or live out unrealized dreams. The paradox of youth is not just a psychological issue, but a philosophical one. Philosophers have long grappled with the concept of time and how we experience it. One central issue is the subjectivity of time, how time feels different depending on our age, perspective, and life stage. The philosopher Henri Bergson argued that time, or la durée, is experienced subjectively and is not something that can be measured simply by clocks or calendars. He believed that the human experience of time is fluid and dependent on consciousness rather than objective measurement. According to Bergson, young people experience time as a continuous flow, an unbroken moment that stretches indefinitely, while older individuals experience time as more fragmented, as they look back on their lives in discrete moments. The paradox of youth illustrates how time perception is tied to the human condition. constantly shifting as we age and accumulate experiences. Psychological research supports the idea that youth's perception of time is linked to the development of the brain, particularly the prefrontal cortex, which governs planning, decision-making, and future thinking. During youth, the prefrontal cortex is still developing, leading to a lack of long-term perspective and an emphasis on immediate gratification. As people age, the prefrontal cortex matures, allowing for better future-oriented thinking and the ability to recognize the limits of time. This transition results in a shift in how individuals view their goals and priorities, moving from present-centric focus to future-oriented, thus leading to the realization that time is finite. The paradox of youth can be seen in many aspects of adult life, particularly in how people approach their careers. Young people often feel that they have limitless time to pursue their ambitions, which can lead to indecision or procrastination. In contrast, adults, with the realization of time's limits, tend to approach decisions with more urgency, but sometimes feel they have missed opportunities along the way. The paradox also applies to the way we plan for the future, particularly in the context of education and financial security. When we are young, the idea of saving for retirement or planning for a future family seems abstract and unnecessary. However, as we age, these concepts become urgent concerns. The paradox of youth serves as a reminder that the choices we make in youth shape our futures, and that time spent in preparation during younger years can make a big difference later in life. Achilles and the tortoise paradox. Imagine a race between Achilles, the fastest runner in ancient Greece, and a tortoise who is much slower. To make the race interesting, Achilles gives the tortoise a head start. As they begin the race, Achilles speeds ahead, quickly closing the gap. However, according to the Achilles and the tortoise paradox, Achilles will never catch the tortoise, no matter how fast he runs. At first, this seems absurd. After all, Achilles is much faster than the tortoise. But the paradox argues that in a race with infinite steps, even the fastest runner is doomed to never win. The paradox works by dividing the distance between Achilles and the tortoise into an infinite number of steps. Each time Achilles reaches where the tortoise has moved a bit further ahead, meaning Achilles always has a small distance left to cover. This seemingly illogical result challenges our understanding of motion, time, and infinity. How can Achilles, moving infinitely fast, never catch the tortoise? Let's explore the Achilles and the tortoise paradox, a puzzle of infinite division and the surprising consequences of infinite steps. The Achilles and the tortoise paradox is one of the famous paradoxes proposed by the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea around the 5th century BCE. Zeno created a series of paradoxes to support the philosophical views of his teacher Parmenides, who believed that reality is unchanging and eternal. Zeno's paradoxes challenge the idea that motion and change are possible, using reasoning that appears to contradict everyday experiences. The paradox of Achilles and the tortoise is one of Zeno's paradoxes of motion, designed to show that our understanding of space and time is flawed. In the paradox, Zeno suggests that no matter how much faster Achilles is than the tortoise, he will never catch up because, in an infinite sequence of steps, Achilles must first reach the point where the tortoise started, then the point where the tortoise moved to next, and so on. This infinite division of space seems to suggest that motion is impossible, as there are an infinite number of distances Achilles must cover before reaching the tortoise. The Achilles and the tortoise paradox was part of a larger series of Zeno's arguments, all aimed at showing that motion is an illusion. These paradoxes influenced later thinkers like Aristotle, who tried to resolve the issues of infinite division and time. In modern times, the paradox has been interpreted in light of infinite series and the mathematics of limits, helping us understand the paradox in a new way. The Achilles and the tortoise paradox is a fascinating example of how infinity and motion intersect in ways that challenge our intuitive understanding of the world. On the surface, it seems clear that Achilles, with his superior speed, will quickly catch up to the slow-moving tortoise. Yet, Zeno's paradox suggests that in an infinite sequence of steps, Achilles will never actually catch the tortoise. To resolve this paradox, we need to delve into the concepts of infinite division, time, and distance, as well as how modern mathematics addresses such paradoxes. Let's break down Zeno's paradox step by step. The setup of the paradox is simple. Achilles runs much faster than the tortoise, and to make it a fair race, Achilles gives the tortoise a head start. Achilles starts running, and as he begins to close the gap, the tortoise moves forward. Zeno argues that before Achilles can catch up to the tortoise, he must reach the point where the tortoise started, but while Achilles reaches this point, the tortoise has already moved forward a little more. In fact, Zeno argues that there will always be an infinite number of steps before Achilles reaches the tortoise. In Zeno's argument, each time Achilles reaches a new point where the tortoise was, the tortoise has moved a bit further. If Achilles is infinitely fast, he can continue running and cover the distance between himself and the tortoise, but, according to the paradox, there will always be an infinite number of steps Achilles must take before he can reach the tortoise. Thus, Achilles can never catch the tortoise, even though he is much faster. Here is how the paradox is broken down. Achilles runs the first distance, let's say from point A to point B, where the tortoise started. By the time Achilles reaches point B, the tortoise has moved to point C, some distance ahead. Achilles then runs from point B to point C, but by the time he reaches point C, the tortoise has moved to point D, and so on. In this way, the distance Achilles needs to cover keeps getting smaller, but because there are an infinite number of steps, Achilles will never completely close the gap. This seemingly illogical result creates the paradox that Achilles, no matter how fast he is, will never catch the tortoise. Mathematically, the Achilles and the tortoise paradox can be understood in terms of infinite series. Zeno's paradox is based on the idea that there are an infinite number of steps that Achilles must take before reaching the tortoise. Each of these steps is smaller than the previous one, but because there are infinitely many steps, it seems impossible for Achilles to reach the tortoise. Let's suppose the tortoise gets a head start of distance d, and that Achilles runs at n times the speed of the tortoise. The sequence of distances that Achilles must run to catch the tortoise looks like this. First, Achilles runs the distance d to where the tortoise started. Then, the tortoise has moved forward by a smaller amount, and Achilles runs that smaller distance. And, again, by the time Achilles runs that second distance, the tortoise has moved a smaller distance, and so on. Mathematically, the total distance Achilles must run can be expressed as the sum of an infinite geometric series. Total distance equals d plus d plus d slash n plus d slash n2 plus d slash n3 plus, where each term is smaller than the last, and the sum of the series can be calculated using the formula s equals a slash 1 minus r, where a equals d and r equals 1 slash n. The details of this series are overwhelmingly minute, but the sum of the series is s equals d slash 1.1 slash n equals nd slash n1. As n increases, the total distance becomes finite, and Achilles does catch the tortoise after a finite amount of time. The paradox then comes not from the infinite nature of the series, but from the perception of an infinite number of steps that creates the illusion of endless delay. The key to resolving the Achilles and the tortoise paradox lies in the concept of convergence in infinite series. While the series of distances Achilles must run is infinite, the total sum is finite. In other words, even though there are an infinite number of steps, the total time it takes Achilles to reach the tortoise is finite. In fact, Achilles will catch the tortoise after a finite amount of time, which seems contradictory to Zeno's conclusion that he can never catch up. This resolution shows that infinity can be handled mathematically through convergence, where an infinite number of terms in a series add up to a finite value. Even though the series is infinite, we intuitively understand that Achilles can indeed catch the tortoise because the distances become smaller and smaller. The time it takes for Achilles to run each successive distance decreases rapidly, and he will eventually close the gap. The paradox arises because we are not used to thinking about infinite steps in this way, but mathematically, the sum of the infinite series converges to a finite value. The Achilles and the tortoise paradox challenges our intuitive understanding of infinity and motion. The paradox demonstrates how infinite processes can seem counterintuitive, but still have a finite result. This is important because it shows that infinity does not necessarily lead to endlessness in the physical world. Instead, infinite steps can be completed in finite time, revealing how infinite processes can be handled mathematically. Zeno's paradoxes, including the Achilles and the tortoise paradox, were designed to show that motion itself might be impossible. By dividing space and time into infinite segments, Zeno argued that movement couldn't exist because it would require traversing an infinite number of steps. Modern mathematics and physics have shown that, while infinite steps may exist, they do not necessarily prevent motion. Instead, infinite processes can result in finite, completable tasks. The concept of convergence in infinite series is essential in fields such as calculus, physics, and engineering. In real-world applications, we often deal with infinite processes that are convergent, such as infinite sums in signal processing, or iterative algorithms that refine solutions through infinite steps. The paradox also has philosophical applications in understanding the nature of time and motion. In a philosophical context, the Achilles and the tortoise paradox raises questions about how we experience and conceptualize movement. Can we truly understand motion when it is divided into infinite parts? The paradox challenges our intuitive understanding of time, suggesting that motion is a series of continuous steps, no matter how small. Archer's paradox. Imagine an archer aiming at a target. They draw back their bowstring, release the arrow, and watch as it flies straight toward the bullseye. But here's the twist. According to the archer's paradox, the arrow should never hit the target. Why? As the archer releases the arrow, the bowstring pushes it forward, causing it to initially move backward before it moves forward. In other words, the arrow, while seemingly aimed directly at the target, must first travel in the opposite direction before it can correct its path and move forward. How can this be? The archer's paradox challenges our intuitive understanding of motion and force. It forces us to think about how forces act on objects in motion, particularly how we perceive instantaneous action and dynamic correction. How does an arrow, traveling backward at first, eventually reach its target? Let's explore the archer's paradox, where motion seems to defy logic, and forces work in ways that defy our immediate perception of the world. The archer's paradox is a concept that has been discussed in physics and mechanics for centuries. The paradox is often attributed to ancient thinkers, particularly Aristotle, who explored how objects in motion respond to forces. The paradox itself stems from a misunderstanding of how forces act on projectiles in motion. The paradox is tied to the concept of the initial force applied to the arrow and how that force affects its motion. As the archer releases the arrow, it seems that the initial velocity of the arrow should be directed straight forward, aimed at the target. However, the force exerted by the bowstring pushes the arrow backwards slightly before it moves forward. This creates an apparent contradiction, since the initial motion seems to go in the wrong direction. Classical mechanics and modern physics offer explanations of how forces work in such scenarios. The paradox shows how initial conditions and instantaneous changes in motion can lead to seemingly contradictory results. Over time, Newtonian mechanics and more advanced concepts in physics have clarified how projectiles work, but the archer's paradox remains a striking example of how motion and force operate in ways that go against common intuition. The archer's paradox presents a unique challenge in understanding the relationship between motion, force, and trajectory. The paradox begins with the observation that when an archer releases an arrow, the arrow does not immediately start its journey toward the target. Instead, there is an initial backward motion, and only after that does the arrow correct its path. This paradox seems to defy our understanding of direct motion and force. Let's explore the mechanics of the archer's paradox, how forces act on the arrow, and why we observe this initial backward motion before the arrow moves forward to strike the target. The paradox arises from the action of the bowstring on the arrow, and how the arrow responds to this force. Here's how the scenario unfolds. The archer draws back the bowstring, creating tension that stores potential energy. When the archer releases the string, the force from the bowstring is transferred to the arrow, propelling it forward. However, instead of immediately traveling straight to the target, the arrow initially moves backward slightly. After this initial backward motion, the arrow corrects its path and moves forward toward the target. At first glance, this backward motion seems illogical. How can an arrow, aimed directly at the target, first travel in the opposite direction before moving toward its goal? This is the core of the archer's paradox. To understand this paradox, we need to consider Newton's first law of motion, which states that an object in motion will stay in motion at a constant velocity unless acted upon by an external force. The arrow is initially at rest before the bowstring exerts a force on it. The force from the bowstring is applied to the tail end of the arrow, but this force is not uniform across the entire arrow's length. The front end of the arrow, where the tip is doesn't feel the same force instantaneously as the back end does. This means that at the moment of release, the front of the arrow will continue to resist the motion due to inertia, while the back of the arrow is pushed by the bowstring. This differential force creates a small backward motion of the arrow before it corrects itself and accelerates toward the target. The arrow's backward motion is the result of inertia and force transmission. The bowstring's push on the arrow is strong enough to initially move the back of the arrow, but the front of the arrow, due to inertia, will resist this sudden force, leading to the brief backward motion. After the initial backward motion, the forces on the arrow quickly become more balanced, and the arrow starts to accelerate toward the target. The correction of the arrow's path happens almost immediately, as the forward-moving bowstring continues to push the arrow along its trajectory. The arrow's center of mass will eventually move forward due to the stronger forward force exerted by the bowstring, and any backward motion becomes negligible in a fraction of a second. The correction occurs because the forward force applied by the bowstring overcomes the initial inertia of the arrow and allows the arrow to move in the desired direction. This process happens quickly and is nearly imperceptible to the naked eye. The momentary backward motion is so brief and small that in practice we don't notice it. We only observe the arrow moving forward after a very short time. But the initial backward motion is an important aspect of understanding how forces are applied to the arrow. When an archer draws back the bowstring, they create tension in the string, storing potential energy. Upon release, the stored energy in the bowstring is converted into kinetic energy that propels the arrow forward. However, the string exerts a force on the arrow, but this force is not applied uniformly along the length of the arrow. The rear end of the arrow experiences a force from the bowstring that accelerates it forward. The front end of the arrow, however, doesn't feel the same force instantly due to inertia. As a result, the arrow bends slightly, causing the initial backward motion. The phenomenon of the arrow bending and flexing slightly at the moment of release contributes to the paradox. Flexing happens because the rear of the arrow is moving faster than the front due to the unequal application of force, leading to a brief moment where the arrow's tip moves in the opposite direction before it corrects itself. This bending is a natural result of the differential forces acting on the arrow, and it explains why the arrow appears to move backward momentarily before moving forward. The amount of bending is small, and its effect is usually minimal, but it's a critical part of the dynamic interaction between the arrow, bowstring, and the forces at play. Despite the initial backward motion, we know that Achilles' arrow will eventually reach its target. The reason for this is that the forward force exerted by the bowstring eventually overcomes the inertia of the arrow's front end. The arrow's path becomes straight and the forward motion dominates. The backward motion occurs only during the moment of force transmission. After this, the arrow travels in the intended direction because the net force exerted on the arrow accelerates it forward. The key takeaway here is that although the backward motion seems contradictory to our expectations, the forces acting on the arrow are balanced quickly, allowing it to correct its trajectory almost immediately. The archer's paradox is rooted in the differential application of force and the arrow's inertia. While the initial backward motion is counterintuitive, it doesn't prevent the arrow from reaching its target because the forces quickly balance out and propel the arrow in the intended direction. The paradox is a misinterpretation of instantaneous events. We expect the arrow to immediately move toward the target, but we fail to account for the brief forces that occur at the very beginning of the shot. The archer's paradox has practical applications in archery and other forms of projectile motion. Understanding how the arrow bends and the forces acting on it helps archers improve their aim and technique. Professional archers are trained to account for the subtle motions of the arrow, adjusting their form to ensure the arrow travels toward the target despite the initial backward motion. The paradox also has implications for the engineering and design of bows. Modern bows are designed to minimize the bending and backward motion of the arrow, ensuring that the force is applied more efficiently to the arrow's center of mass. By reducing the initial backward motion, the efficiency of the bow increases, leading to more precise shots. Arrow paradox. Imagine an arrow flying through the air, aimed straight at its target. It moves fast, slicing through the air with precision. But, according to the arrow paradox, while the arrow is in flight, it isn't actually moving at all. This paradox, proposed by the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea, challenges our understanding of motion and time. According to Zeno, when you observe an arrow in flight, It occupies a series of instantaneous moments, each of which is a still image in time. At each moment, the arrow is stationary, occupying a particular place. How, then, can it move from one place to another? If every moment the arrow is still, how can motion exist? The arrow paradox suggests that if motion is made up of instantaneous moments, and each moment is without motion, then motion itself is an illusion. This paradox forces us to reconsider our intuitive understanding of time, motion, and how we perceive change. Let's explore the arrow paradox, where time and motion seem to defy logic, leading us to question how change can occur in a universe made up of infinite moments. The arrow paradox is one of several paradoxes formulated by Zeno, of Elea, a Greek philosopher who lived around the 5th century BCE. Zeno is best known for his paradoxes, which challenged the understanding of motion, change, and time, and sought to defend the philosophical ideas of his teacher, Parmenides, who argued that reality is unchanging and that all perceived changes are mere illusions. The arrow paradox was designed to show that motion is impossible or logically inconsistent. Zeno asked, if time is made up of discrete moments, and if at each moment the arrow is not moving, then how can it ever reach its target? Zeno argued that if we divide time into an infinite number of moments, and in each moment the arrow is stationary, then motion is impossible, because there is no time in which the arrow is actually in motion. The paradox has become one of the most famous puzzles in the history of philosophy, especially in the philosophy of time and motion. It has intrigued philosophers, of mathematicians, and physicists for centuries, inspiring debates about the nature of time, infinity, and continuity. In modern times, the paradox has been resolved using calculus and concepts of limits. Nevertheless, the paradox remains a thought-provoking example of how ancient philosophers grappled with the deep questions about the nature of change and the passage of time. At first glance, it seems impossible for an arrow to move at all if it is stationary at every instant. However, this paradox can be resolved by understanding how we conceptualize motion, time, and infinity. Let's break down the paradox, explore its implications, and discuss how modern mathematics provides a solution. The arrow paradox is based on Zeno's observation that time consists of a series of instantaneous moments. These moments are like snapshots, where everything is static, with no change occurring. Zeno argued that if motion is composed of such moments, and if the arrow is not moving in any single moment, then the arrow can't possibly be moving at all. Here's how the paradox unfolds. The arrow is in mid-fleet toward its target. At each individual moment of time, the arrow is stationary. It occupies a single position in space and isn't moving. Since the arrow is not moving in any individual moment, Zeno reasoned that it cannot be moving at all. How can it move forward if it's motionless in every moment? The paradox creates a conflict between our intuitive understanding of motion and the idea that time consists of discrete, indivisible moments. If time is divided into infinitely small moments, and the arrow is stationary at each of those moments, then how does the arrow travel from one place to another? This is the arrow paradox, the impossibility of motion in an infinite number of moments. If we consider each moment as a separate snapshot of reality, and if the arrow is stationary in each snapshot, then motion seems impossible. If the arrow is still in every moment of time, then it never moves. The paradox implies that motion is a series of infinitesimal snapshots where nothing is moving. The question is, how can anything move when each individual moment is motionless? The arrow paradox assumes that time is discrete, made up of separate, indivisible moments. In this view, the arrow must be stationary in each moment because there is no time in which motion can occur. Each moment is a snapshot, and motion would require a continuous flow of time. However, in modern physics and mathematics, time is generally considered to be continuous, not discrete. This means that instead of being made up of distinct, isolated moments, time is a flowing process in which events occur gradually over an infinite number of infinitesimally small intervals. In a continuous model of time, there is no need to treat each individual moment as separate, and motion can occur as the arrow gradually moves through time. The paradox can be resolved by understanding the concept of limits in calculus. In the 17th century, Isaac Newton and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz developed the foundations of calculus, which deals with infinitely small changes and the sum of infinite processes. In calculus, we can handle infinite sequences in such a way that they converge to a finite result. To understand the paradox in terms of calculus, consider the distance the arrow travels. The total distance the arrow moves can be expressed as the sum of an infinite series of distances, where each successive distance becomes smaller and smaller. The key idea in calculus is that the sum of an infinite number of small distances can still result in a finite distance. For example, the distance the arrow travels from its starting point to the target can be written as the sum of infinitely many smaller distances, each corresponding to the motion of the arrow in an individual instant. Even though there are an infinite number of steps, the total distance traveled is finite because the sum of the infinite series converges to a finite value. The paradox arises from a misunderstanding of instantaneous motion. Zeno assumed that motion must be a series of discrete steps, each of which is instantaneous and motionless. However, modern physics shows that motion is continuous, not discrete. Even though motion can be described as a series of instantaneous positions, these positions are part of a continuous process where the arrow is constantly moving from one point to the next. In modern mathematics, we understand that infinite series can converge to a finite result. In the case of the arrow, the total distance it travels can be broken down into an infinite number of smaller distances. But this infinite series still adds up to a finite total distance. The arrow paradox creates an illusion of infinite steps, but these steps don't prevent the arrow from moving forward. By using the concept of limits from calculus, we can show that the sum of the infinite series describing the arrow's motion converges to a finite value. This means that even though the arrow is stationary in each individual instant, its motion over time is continuous and results in a finite distance traveled. Similarly, the time it takes for the arrow to reach the target can also be expressed as the sum of infinitely many time intervals. While there are infinite steps in the process of reaching the target, the total time taken for the arrow to travel is finite because the series of time intervals converges. This is consistent with our observation that motion, even though it can be broken down into infinite steps, still happens in a finite amount of time. Zeno's paradox is rooted in our perception of motion as a series of discrete moments, each of which seems static. However, when we look at motion from a mathematical and physical perspective, we see that it is actually a continuous process. The arrow paradox challenges our intuition by suggesting that motion is impossible because of the infinite number of steps involved. But modern mathematics has shown that these infinite steps do not prevent motion from happening. The arrow paradox is closely related to how we understand motion in physics. In classical mechanics, motion is typically described as a continuous change in position over time, and this description is consistent with our everyday experiences. The paradox highlights the difference between how we intuitively think about motion and how we mathematically model it in physics. The resolution of the arrow paradox using infinite series and limits has practical applications in fields such as engineering, signal processing, and fluid dynamics. These fields often deal with processes that involve infinitely small changes and require the summation of infinite terms to arrive at a solution.